Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a place where curiosity settles in and science takes the scenic, slow road towards sleep. Tonight's gentle expedition floats above an ocean of golden dunes over horizons that seem to ripple like waves, frozen mid-crest. We're heading into a region many picture as lifeless, endless, and void. Yet beneath that quiet surface may rest some of the earliest murmurs of human civilization, the Sahara Desert, a landscape that appears outside of time, yet may be guarding time's oldest secrets. Before we wander too deeply into the sand, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it peaceful around you? Maybe the air is cool, or maybe it carries the distant murmur of late-night traffic or the faint swish of curtains in the dark. Wherever you are, I'd like you to imagine the desert for a moment, not as a cruel place, but as one vast, resting body, inhaling and exhaling slowly beneath the stars. If this little journey brings you any sense of calm, if the blend of science and mystery helps you drift a bit further into thought or into rest, a like or a subscription would help this quiet corner of curiosity find others who might be needing it too. For now, settle in. And let's begin. Because somewhere under the dunes, long before pyramids and pharaohs, before history learned to write itself down, there may have been people who called this sea of sand their home. Today, the Sahara stretches across more than 9 million square kilometers, covering almost the entire crown of North Africa. From the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea in the east, it is the largest hot desert on the planet, a continent tucked inside a continent. Seen from above, it looks almost otherworldly. Mountain chains drowned in dunes, desiccated riverbeds coiling like veins through a body that once pulsed with water. Here is the strange part. For most of human existence, it didn't look like this. The Sahara as we know it, this blazing, seemingly endless expanse of sun-hardened sand might be only a temporary phase, a brief dry chapter in a story that has mostly been wet. If we could rewind the planet's timeline, not just by centuries but by tens of thousands of years, we'd discover that much of what is now sand was once savanna. Sweeps of green plain punctuated by lakes and wandering rivers, home to giraffes, hippos, elephants, and early humans. The air would have vibrated with insects, the ground yielding and cool under bare feet. It was alive, generous, and flourishing. Scientists call these intervals African humid periods eras, when the regional climate shifted dramatically and desert was transformed into grassland. The most recent of these humid phases ended around 5,000 years ago, just about the time ancient Egypt began to rise along the Nile. Maybe that timing is a coincidence, or maybe it isn't. The Sahara's transformations follow a cosmic beat. Roughly every 20,000 years, Earth's tilt and orbit around the sun adjust just slightly. Those subtle shifts change how and where sunlight warms the continents. When summers in the northern hemisphere grow a bit warmer, the monsoon systems push farther north. Rainfall sweeps into the Sahara. The desert greens. When the cycle swings back, the rains recede, and green once again gives way to gold. This quiet breathing of the planet has repeated for millions of years. Lush, then dry. Lush again, then dry again, painting in and wiping away landscapes and perhaps cultures that never made it into written records. For archaeologists, this cycle is both blessing and curse. Sand preserves things wonderfully, but it also buries them deeply. Orbiting satellites have traced the outlines of ancient river systems secreted beneath the dunes, their channels still visible from space. They've also spotted the ghosts of vast lake beds, so large they may have rivaled our modern inland seas. Some researchers suspect that within those buried basins, entire webs of human settlements may be entombed, waiting for some future excavation. It's as though the desert itself is holding its breath, saving its revelations for another time. For hundreds of years, travelers and scholars have wondered whether, before Egypt and before Mesopotamia, maybe even before the Indus Valley, there might have been a civilization here that disappeared, not drowned by rising waters, but erased by the lack of them. They point to ancient rock art, enigmatic stone circles, and scattered tools lying across regions that seem impossibly hostile today. Each artifact implies that people not only survived here, they flourished. Picture yourself in what is now the Central Sahara, near the Tassili Niger Plateau in southern Algeria. At first glance, everything seems bare: ochre rock, blowing sand, and wind. But then you walk into a sheltered ravine, and the stone around you comes alive. On the walls are paintings, thousands of them, of cattle herds, people dancing, figures swimming, hunters aiming bows and spears. The scenes feel joyous, vivid, and completely out of place in a desert that hasn't felt real rain in thousands of years. They speak of flowing rivers and wide grasslands, of communities that built their lives around water and migration. It's almost impossible not to ask, who were these people? Were they nomads simply following the shifting green as the rains moved? Or were they something more settled, a rooted society that built, traded, and shaped a culture, only for the wind to bury most of what they left behind? Some of the clues lean toward the latter. Across Niger, Chad, Libya, and Egypt, archaeologists have unearthed broken pottery, shaped stone tools, and remnants of dwellings. These aren't just rough campsites. They show signs of coordinated living, storage pits, hearths, and planned layouts that suggest forethought and shared design. Far in southwestern Egypt lies one of the Sahara's most intriguing sites, Nabta Playa. To an untrained observer, it's just a dry depression scattered with stones. But in the late 20th century, archaeologists realized those stones weren't strewn randomly. They had been deliberately arranged, some in lines that matched the positions of the solstices, others in circles that may be 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. Nabta Playa was active around 7,000 years ago, when the Sahara was still green. People likely gathered there seasonally, perhaps to mark the arrival of the rains and to honor the patterns of the stars. At this point, the Sahara's story begins to sound less like distant prehistory, and more like a forgotten opening chapter of civilization. These were not isolated foragers. They were skywatchers, herders, and builders of ritual. They engineered memory into stone. When aridity crept back, they may have followed the Nile eastward, carrying with them knowledge of water management, early crops, and the movements of the heavens. Some scholars even suggest that the birth of Egyptian civilization was seeded by these west to east migrations out of a drying Sahara. It's not a settled fact, but it's a compelling idea. The Sahara, often imagined as a cradle of emptiness, may instead have been the cradle before the better-known cradle. Satellite imagery continues to feed this evolving picture. High-resolution scans show patterns beneath the sand that look strikingly like river deltas and floodplains. Some show concentric forms that might be natural geology or the ghost outlines of human settlements. One region in Mauritania, known as the Rishat structure, and more poetically as the Eye of the Sahara, has stirred debate for decades. It's a huge circular feature visible from orbit, made of concentric rock rings. Geologists identify it as a natural uplifted dome, worn down over immense spans of time. But its symmetry, immense scale, and the presence of ancient artifacts in the surrounding areas have led some to speculate that it was once a focal point of early human activity. A few even link it, imaginatively, to Plato's tale of Atlantis. The evidence doesn't support that link, but the fact that the idea persists tells us something important. The desert invites speculation precisely because it hides more than it shows. For researchers working in the Sahara today, simply getting to these places can be as challenging as interpreting them. The landscape is always on the move. Dunes advance like slow waves, and temperatures can swing from searing to near freezing within a single day. Yet with tools like ground-penetrating radar, satellite remote sensing, and detailed isotope studies, scientists are gradually reconstructing the Sahara's former face. Samples of fossil pollen and cores drilled from ancient lake sediments give undeniable proof of past abundance. They show traces of grasses, trees, and water-loving plants that no longer grow here. This wasn't just a marginally livable region, it was rich. That richness altered the course of human evolution. Early Homo sapiens, and even older human relatives use these green corridors as passageways. The Sahara hasn't always been a wall between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. For long intervals, it was a bridge. Genetic evidence suggests that during wet phases, populations traveled and mixed across great distances, sharing tools, languages, and ideas. When the desert returned, those same groups became isolated again, each preserving parts of a once shared culture. It's like watching a heartbeat in very slow motion. Connection, separation, reconnection, separation, unfolding over tens of thousands of years. Looking at the modern Sahara, it can feel almost impossible to imagine life flourishing here. And yet, every grain of sand belongs to that memory. The wind still exposes fragments. Fossil fish, petrified wood, even old footprints pressed into what was once soft, muddy ground. It's as if the desert sometimes exhales, briefly revealing what it's been guarding. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: the Sahara is unlikely to remain dry forever. The same orbital cycles that turned it green in the past will eventually do so again. It may take thousands of years, but the rains will come back. New rivers will carve their paths through the dunes. Lakes will spread across the low-lying basins, and life will return. If human beings are still here to witness it, we might see the desert's rebirth with our own distant descendants' eyes. A second chance for a landscape that has watched civilizations arrive and recede like waves against an ageless shore. Until that distant future, the Sahara keeps its own counsel. The buried rivers continue to trace their courses in darkness. The rock paintings wait patiently in shadowed canyons. The stories of those who once lived, worked, and dreamed here remain half hidden, half carried by the wind. The desert remembers. And as we drift further into its memory, the next leg of our journey will pull us back in time to an era when the Sahara wasn't a desert at all, but a vast garden of life, a place where the earth itself felt younger, where rivers ran where now only sand slides, and where the earliest sparks of human imagination began to take hold beneath a sky heavy with rain. When most of us picture the Sahara, we see heat wavering off the sand in quivering sheets, an unending sweep of dunes under a sky so bright it almost feels metallic. But long before this landscape turned dry and silent under the sun's weight, the Sahara was green. Not just a scattering of grass around a few lonely oases, but a sprawling, dynamic ecosystem that stretched from the Atlantic shore to the Red Sea. It was alive with rivers, trees, and lakes so large they would make many of our present-day lakes seem small. To really see it, you have to temporarily set aside your idea of desert. Forget the glare, the dust, the mirages. Instead, imagine broad plains covered in tall, waving grasses interrupted by stands of acacia, antelope grazing in patches of shade, elephants wading through shallow pools, crocodiles gliding into reed-choked channels. Picture afternoon thunderstorms, heavy monsoon clouds rolling in and turning the soil dark and fragrant. The air would have been thick with the scent of wet earth. Above it all, the same constellations we recognize now would have shone down, reflected in mirror-still lakes that have long since become basins of dust. This restless, thriving world didn't exist only once. The Sahara's greening has come and gone many times over. It followed the slow, predictable dance of Earth's orbit, a cosmic metronome ticking along with the tilt of our planet. Roughly every 20,000 years, that tilt shifts just enough to redirect where and how much rain falls. During certain phases, monsoon winds push farther north, hauling moisture deep into what is currently desert. Grasslands advance, rivers wake up. The Sahara inhales. Then, as the tilt eases back, the monsoons retreat southward, the rains weaken, and the desert exhales. Grass dies back, lakes shrink and vanish, dunes creep over the skeletons of old rivers. This breathing cycle has repeated again and again for millions of years. In the last major green phase, roughly between 14,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara reached its most welcoming state for humans and animals alike. The evidence is layered beneath today's sand. In many places, scientists have found the remains of fish, hippos, and crocodiles, animals that cannot survive in a true desert. Pollen grains locked into ancient mud tell us which plants were there. Grasses, shrubs, and trees that now live far to the south. This wasn't just a scatter of oases. It was a fully transformed region. If you could have stood here then, perhaps in what is now central Libya or Chad, you might have seen water stretching to the horizon. Some lakes like ancient Mega-Chad were immense, larger even than the modern Caspian Sea. That scale is hard to overlay onto today's dry maps, but the proof is hard to ignore. From orbit, the faint arcs of these lost shorelines still outline their shapes, looping across the landscape like the delicate edges of ghost coastlines. In the old basins, you can still find tiny shells from freshwater snails, the scattered bones of fish, even footprints pressed into what was once damp, sticky mud and later turned to stone. The creatures that lived there speak for themselves through both fossils and rock art. Their images show elephants, giraffes, buffalo, and lions, turtles and crocodiles, and notably, domestic cattle. These animals weren't just passing through. They were part of the system. They grazed, hunted, nested, and bred in what is now some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Back then, it was a balanced, flourishing ecosystem. It's a powerful reminder that climate is never fixed. The version of Earth we experience now is just one frame in a much longer film, a moment between swings of heat, water, and wind. And wherever there were animals, there were human beings. All across the region, archaeologists have turned up tools and artifacts, some tens of thousands of years old. Finely chipped stone blades, scrapers used for hides, early pottery fragments. They hint at people who hunted and fished and gathered food long before the dunes arrived, living along those lake shores, maybe moving with the seasons, setting up temporary camps that nonetheless remained in use for generations. Their world would have been saturated with color. Green fields, deep blue or muddy brown lakes, steel gray storm clouds and blood red sunsets. They left that world on the rock itself. In the mountains of Algeria's Tassili Najer, the concentration of rock art is almost overwhelming. Walls and overhangs are crowded with imagery swimmers, archers, women carrying vessels, animals that wouldn't last a day in the modern Sahara. The pigment has faded over millennia, but what it represents hasn't. These weren't people merely scraping by. They had enough time and security to watch, to paint, to remember. Their art makes it clear that they did not see this place as temporary or marginal. To them, this green Sahara was simply home. In many of those scenes, you see the unmistakable outline of cattle being herded, a detail that carries far more meaning than it might at first glance. Domesticated cattle imply an organized way of living. Herding demands planning, knowing where water will be, when grass will sprout, and how to move in step with the seasons. It requires cooperation and shared knowledge, exactly the kind of social fabric that becomes the spine of community. This was not just a scattering of isolated hunters. It was a coordinated society, shaped by and attuned to the land's rhythms. When researchers began assigning dates to artifacts from these green periods, a striking pattern emerged. The final drying of this last humid age lines up closely with the dawn of complex cultures along the Nile. As the Sahara slowly lost its lakes and grasslands, the people who once spread across its interior may have begun drifting toward the one river that never failed. The Nile offered something rare: dependable water. For those who understood how to follow rains, manage herds, and read the sky, that river valley would have been a natural place to regroup and reinvent their lives. Out of that relocation, agriculture took deeper root. Permanent settlements formed. Over time, those foundations hardened into what we now call civilization. That tight link between environmental change and human transformation may be one of the Sahara's most enduring lessons. When the world shifted, people didn't simply vanish. They adapted, moved, learned, and reshaped their way of living. The drying of the Sahara wasn't only a natural catastrophe. it was also a catalyst that may have steered the course of history. Without it, the Egypt we recognize might never have formed in quite the same way. Even in its lushest ages, though, the Sahara was not an unbroken carpet of green. It was complex. Some areas supported thick vegetation. Others remained open savanna. Some stayed semi-arid even at the wettest times. Rain fell unevenly in belts and bands. Some years were generous. Others were stingier. Lakes expanded, then contracted. Rivers shifted course. To thrive here demanded flexibility and deep, place-based knowledge. People learned to read the sky, follow herds, recognize plants that pointed to hidden water, and navigate an environment that was always in motion. The lakes themselves were entire worlds. Some were shallow and short-lived, forming only in especially wet years. Others persisted for thousands of years. Sediment cores drilled from their basins show thin laminations of clay, silt, and organic matter stacking up over time. Each layer is like a page in a diary, a record of when the rains came, which plants flourished, how heavily life pulsed through the region. By analyzing tiny grains of pollen carried by wind from far-off forests, scientists can even estimate how far the greening spread during peak humid phases. One of the most striking findings from these cores is the presence of microscopic algae and diatoms that only survive in fresh water. Their shells, preserved in mud, act as tiny timestamps, confirming that standing lakes once covered areas we now know only as sandfields. Some of those lakes lasted long enough to develop unique ecosystem species that existed nowhere else. When the waters finally disappeared, those species vanished too. In a sense, the modern desert is built on their remains. To stand in one of those ancient basins now is to feel the weight of all that change. The ground is pale, cracked, and hard. The horizon smears and shimmers in the heat. Yet only a few meters down, the soil can still hold traces of moisture. In certain spots, the same groundwater that once fed those ancient lakes remains sealed in deep aquifers. Modern oases draw from that inheritance. Every grove of date palms that rises suddenly out of the emptiness is a faint echo of the Sahara's former lushness. The Sahara's green story doesn't belong to Africa alone. Similar wet-dry cycles unfolded in the Arabian Peninsula, in India's Thar Desert, and even in parts of Australia. These repeating global patterns remind us that climate is woven together on a planetary scale, tugged by orbital wobble and shifts in solar input far beyond human control. When one desert blooms, another might wither. When one river disappears, a new one may appear somewhere else. The Earth is always redistributing its water, wind, and warmth, trading them between regions like slow, deliberate breaths. By decoding these ancient shifts, scientists can better anticipate what might happen next. If the Sahara has turned green before, could it become green again? In theory, yes. The same orbital cycles that powered the last African humid period will return over the next 10,000 years. As Earth's tilt and orbit continue their slow dance, the Sahara could once again transform into sweeping grassland. There are hints, small early signals, that this kind of change can happen swiftly once certain thresholds are crossed. Some climate models suggest that with just enough additional rainfall and plant cover, a desert region can flip relatively quickly into a wetter state. But now there is a complication. Us. Human-driven greenhouse gas emissions and rapid global warming may change or even override the natural cycles. If rainfall patterns are reshaped by our influence, the Sahara's future may not mirror its past. A pattern written in celestial mechanics for millions of years could be pushed off course by what happens within a couple of centuries on the ground. It's a sobering thought. Yet the vision of a green Sahara continues to captivate our imagination. It reorients how we view deserts, not as lifeless blanks, but as stages of transition. The sand hides not just bones and broken pots, but memory. It's a reminder that even the most relentless landscapes once teemed with life, and might again. For the ancient humans who witnessed the Sahara's greening, it must have felt like a world-sized miracle. Imagine coming from generations that knew mostly dry, marginal lands and then encountering rivers that flowed year after year, herds of animals grazing in plenty, and soil that practically invited seeds to grow. It would have seemed like the planet itself had turned generous. They built their lives around that generosity. They trusted it. When it began to falter, they must have watched in bewilderment as shorelines receded and rains became fickle. Slowly, home turned back into hazard. The grasses yielded to dust. And yet, even as it dried, the Sahara offered lessons. Those who endured the change carried their experiences with them. They recorded them in rock art, in the arrangement of stones, in tools buried in layers of sediment, and in stories passed down out loud. Some of those stories traveled far, surviving in cultures far removed from the physical desert as tales of lost gardens and rivers that vanished. The desert remembers because people insisted on remembering it. Each artifact brought to light, each image uncovered on a canyon wall is another piece of that memory surfacing. When a scientist kneels in the sand and brushes aside grains to uncover a shard of pottery or the impression of an ancient fish, they aren't just collecting evidence. They're reopening a conversation that's been quiet for thousands of years. The next time you see a satellite photo of the Sahara, try rearranging it in your mind. Don't see only a sea of beige dunes. Imagine a wide mosaic of green. Picture faint rings where lakes once came to shore, shadowy threads where rivers once ran. Think of elephant tracks and the outline of modest human camps hugging the waterline. Somewhere beneath those dunes, there may still be the remains of villages, tools, and even burial grounds that were old long before the pyramids rose. The past isn't gone, it's asleep. As we keep tracing this older version of the Sahara, our next step takes us deeper still into the lost arteries of the desert, the buried rivers that once carried its lifeblood all the way to the sea. They're still there, silent and unseen, but their courses tell a story that could reshape what we think we know about where civilization truly began. Beneath the Sahara's dunes, hidden under layers of sand that can reach kilometers thick, lie the ghost paths of rivers that once stitched together a completely different world. You can't see them with your eyes now, but from space, their traces remain faint scars crossing the face of a sleeping land. Ancient riverbeds, long dry, meander through the subsurface like veins in cross-section, some stretching hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. Their shapes are unmistakable: branching deltas, looping bends, wide floodplains that once carried water, and everything that depends on it. If we could peel the desert back like a thin blanket, we would find the arteries of a landscape that once pulsed with movement, linking lakes, forests, and human communities. The story of these buried rivers begins far before written history, in an age when climate and geology worked together to build vast flowing networks across what is now considered empty. Geologists, using radar imaging, satellite data, and sediment analysis, have identified at least half a dozen major river systems preserved beneath the Sahara. Among them are the Tamanrasset River, the Kufra system, the Sahabi, and several others, whose old courses once led from deep within the African interior all the way to the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. These aren't guesses. They are real river channels, frozen into the rock and sand like fossils of motion. The Tamanrasset River is perhaps the most astonishing of them all. Its outline first emerged in the early 2000s when scientists processed radar data from satellites scanning the Western Sahara. Once the noise was filtered out, a colossal valley appeared on their screens. A river channel running from the Hagar Mountains in present-day southern Algeria, across the desert's core, and down toward the coast of Mauritania, where it once emptied into the Atlantic. If it flowed today, the Tamanrasset would rival the Niger or even the Nile. Its basin covered more than 1 million square kilometers, and during the wettest periods it may have transported as much water as the Mississippi River. The revelation of this hidden giant changed how scientists imagined the Sahara's past. It suggested that this wasn't merely a patchwork of isolated lakes surrounded by grassy margins. It had been a fully integrated hydrological system, a web of flowing channels connecting wetlands, forests, and floodplains. Fish, crocodiles, and early humans could have traveled for hundreds of kilometers along its waters, It tied together ecosystems and peoples long before anyone carved symbols into stone or baked clay into tablets. Imagining these rivers running again is like glimpsing an alternate version of Earth, one that occupied the same space but at a different moment in time. Along the banks of the Tamanrasset, vegetation would have wrapped the channel in green. Reeds and papyrus might have lined the shallows. Fig trees and willows could have shaded the banks. Herds of gazelle and antelope would have gathered to drink at twilight, pressing their hooves into mud soft enough to hold tracks until the next rain. And where animals gather, people follow. Archaeological work near the old Tamanrasset Basin has uncovered stone tools and artifacts dated to around 10,000 years ago, belonging to cultures that flourished during the last African humid period. These aren't crude or random. They're carefully made points, scrapers, and blades objects that reveal a practiced understanding of stone, of hunting, and of daily life. Whoever crafted them wasn't barely surviving. They were thriving in a landscape that gave them food, water, and room to move. Farther east, beneath the sands of Libya and Egypt, lies the trace of another forgotten river system, the Kufra. Using satellite radar, scientists have mapped channels and deltas buried beneath the eastern Sahara, showing that this river once flowed north toward what is now the Mediterranean coast. It linked a chain of ancient basins in what we now call the Kufra and Tibesti regions. In its time, the Kufra system would have been a massive conveyor of life, feeding large wetlands stocked with fish, attracting birds, grazing animals, and humans who set up seasonal camps or perhaps semi-permanent villages along its edges. The old riverbanks, now fossilized, still hold the fine clays and silts that only long-standing water can leave behind. Some of these buried channels connect directly to underground water reserves that still exist, fossil aquifers holding ancient rainfall. The Nubian sandstone aquifer system, stretching across Egypt, Libya, Chad, and Sudan, is one of the largest such reservoirs on Earth. It is essentially the trapped memory of those ancient rivers, a hidden ocean preserved beneath the rock. When wells are drilled into it today, the water that rises may have fallen as rain tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years ago. Every cool drop brought up from those depths is like a message from a greener earth, resurfacing for a brief moment in our present. This concealed river network tells us that the Sahara wasn't always a remote backcountry separated from the rest of Africa. It was part of a vast living circulation system. Rivers bound the interior of the continent to its coasts, carving corridors that likely guided early human migration. Around 100,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens began moving out of Africa, these water routes may have offered natural pathways north. Instead of confronting unbroken dunes, our ancestors may have followed flowing water, resting beneath trees, guided by the sounds of birds, frogs, and the constant murmur of a river familiar sounds of home in a changing landscape. One of the most compelling lines of evidence for these ancient watercourses doesn't come from the surface at all. It comes from the sky. Using satellite radar instruments such as those flown during NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission, scientists have been able to see through the shallow upper layers of sand and detect the shapes of buried terrain. Radar waves bounce differently off rock, moist sediment, and dry dune sand, allowing researchers to distinguish old channels from the surrounding geology. It's like holding an X-ray up to the planet and watching its skeletal structure reveal itself. Those images have shown expansive, branching networks, old river deltas with braided channels, wide floodplains where water once spilled out, and basins where lakes pooled and slowly infiltrated into the ground. Among the most impressive of these ancient lakes is the giant precursor to Lake Chad, often called Mega Chad. At its largest, it filled much of what is now Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. At its peak, it may have covered almost 400,000 square kilometers, an inland sea larger than all 5 of North America's Great Lakes combined. Its shores would have been lined with fishers and herders, its waters crowded with hippos and crocodiles. In time, as the climate shifted, that inland sea shrank. Today's Lake Chad is a tiny remnant, a fragile puddle compared to its former self. But its sediments still hold evidence of ancient life. Fish remains, mollusk shells, and traces of human hearths and tools buried in layers of silt. The presence of such lakes and river systems doesn't just rewrite the Sahara's environmental history. It reshapes how we think about human history. For a long time, common wisdom held that the world's earliest large, complex societies grew up independently along the big, reliable rivers, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus. But the Sahara's lost rivers complicate that picture. If there were once extensive interconnected waterways flowing through North Africa, then it's possible that early communities here developed surprisingly complex cultures long before we fully recognized them. Evidence from sites like Nabta Playa showing astronomical awareness, organized ritual spaces, and animal domestication supports this emerging view. Civilization along the Nile may not have burst forth fully formed from the river's own valley. It may have been gently nourished, at least in part, by the last lifeblood of the Sahara's rivers. Yet most of the desert remains almost untouched by excavation. Political instability, the sheer size of the region, and its hostile conditions all make fieldwork difficult. Much of what we know right now comes from remote sensing observing from afar, rather than digging directly into the sand. Researchers can map the outlines of these buried systems, trace their paths, and model their flow, but actually reaching them on the ground, uncovering the artifacts, fossils, and traces of human settlements they might conceal, is much harder. Each expedition contends with extreme heat, shifting ground, and the constant risk of being caught in sudden sandstorms that can erase tracks and bury equipment within hours. Still, the search goes on. Teams equipped with drones, ground-penetrating radar, and high-precision GPS instruments are charting more pieces of these ghost rivers every year. Even in places long thought barren, traces of ancient occupation persist. Charred hearths, grinding stones, fragments of pottery nestled in dry channels. These are the fingerprints of people who lingered at the edges of fading waters, living along the banks long after the rivers had weakened. What's especially striking is how recently some of these channels may have held water. Analyses of sediments suggest that in parts of the central Sahara, rivers or substantial streams may have flowed as recently as 5,000 years ago, extremely recent on a geological timescale. In some valleys, rare storms still send brief torrents rushing through the dry beds. For a few hours, dusty ravines transform into roaring streams, only to vanish again into evaporation and sand. Standing in one of those wadis during an unexpected storm would be like watching the ancient Sahara flicker back to life for a moment. There is a paradox at the heart of all this. Under one of the driest regions on Earth is overwhelming evidence of water everywhere. The Sahara, despite its silence, is anything but lifeless in geological memory. It is layered with history. Its sands lie like pages in a book written and rewritten by climate, wind, and time. Each dune might once have been a riverbank. Each grain of sand, a fragment of rock worn smooth by water that hasn't flowed here in 10,000 years. In the central and northern reaches of the desert, countless smaller tributaries branch into and away from the main buried rivers. These smaller channels once fed basins that supported pockets of life herds of animals, clusters of human camps, fields of seasonal plants. The patterns align so consistently that scientists can reconstruct entire ancient drainage networks. When they compare those networks to the distribution of archaeological sites, another pattern emerges. Human settlements tend to line up neatly along the paths of these vanished rivers. It's a powerful overlay of evidence. People lived by water, followed water, and left their stories along water's edge, even after the rivers themselves were gone. Some researchers think these river systems did more than just host local ecosystems. They may have actively shaped weather. During green phases, the Sahara's vegetation and standing water would have influenced local and regional climate, promoting further rain in a self-reinforcing loop. Rivers fed moisture to the air fed storms, and the cycle sustained itself. Once that loop broke, once rivers thinned and vegetation retreated, dust took over. Dust reflects sunlight and alters atmospheric circulation. The monsoon belt shifted southward. Rain became scarce, and the desert expanded, taking the memory of flowing rivers with it. But that memory never disappeared entirely. It survives not only in rock and sand, but in story. Among local communities, Tuareg, Berber, Tubu, and many others, There are tales of ancestral lands where grass grew high and lakes were so wide you couldn't see the far shore. In Tuareg and Berber oral traditions, you find references to old valleys, springs, and wells that vanished long ago. These aren't vague, mythical places. They are described with detail, as though someone once stood there and saw them. When scientists compare many of these oral accounts with modern satellite maps, the correspondences are often uncanny. Locations spoken of in legend match up with real buried river systems or ancient lake basins. It's as though cultural memory endured where water could not. Local stories kept a map alive in words that technology is only now confirming. That's one of the most haunting reminders the Sahara offers. History isn't only written in books or carved into surviving monuments. Sometimes it's carried in voices, kept alive around campfires under the same stars that once reflected in vanished streams. In recent decades, the urgency to understand these hidden rivers has grown. As global climate change accelerates, the Sahara's past may offer clues to the future. If this desert has turned green multiple times, if rivers have appeared and disappeared on a rhythm, what happens when that rhythm intersects with human-driven warming? Some scientists have suggested that under certain conditions, with enough rainfall and the right kind of vegetation, parts of the Sahara could rapidly shift to a wetter state again. Others propose using this knowledge to actively encourage small-scale greening, reforestation projects, careful irrigation, and landscape restoration that might revive at least fragments of the ancient cycles. These ideas are ambitious, but they're rooted in the same evidence that first revealed the Tamanrasset and its sister rivers. There is still water here, still memory, still possibility. The lost rivers of the Sahara are more than geological curiosities. They are reminders of impermanence and resilience. The earth remodels itself repeatedly. Landscapes we think of as fixed are just temporary arrangements of matter and energy. Yet each version leaves evidence behind maps of what was possible, proof that even the harshest environments can host abundance in the right conditions. If the desert conceals the story of water, it also conceals the story of persistence. Every empty channel once carried movement, sound, and connection. Every basin once held more than water. It held human plans, tools, rituals, and dreams. The rivers may have vanished, but the lives that grew along them may still lie, waiting in the layers beneath. And so, as the wind continues to comb the dunes, reshaping them into new waves and ridges, the memory of those ancient rivers hums quietly below. If we listen closely to the wind, to the sand, to the data, we can almost hear the faint echo of water still flowing. That echo leads us naturally to another question. If these rivers once carried life across the Sahara, what remains of the people who walked their shores, fished their depths, and crossed their currents, long before the sand took over? Somewhere beneath our feet, their traces are still here, waiting to be uncovered, grain by grain. When the desert wind calms, the Sahara sometimes lets something go, not in a sudden reveal, but slowly, as if exhaling a secret it has held for too long. Maybe a shard of pottery emerges, the curve of a bone, or a trail of shallow depressions hardened into ancient mud footprints. At first, they hardly look like anything, just small marks in the ground, scattered across a barren landscape. But to archaeologists, those traces are profound. They are proof that real people once walked where now only wind moves, evidence that life once organized itself along shores and banks that exist today only as dry depressions. Footprints are some of the most fragile records a landscape can hold. They survive only under very particular conditions. The ground has to be wet enough to take an impression, then dry quickly, and then be covered just enough to protect the shape from erosion. In most places, that chain of events is broken. Prints vanish within days, but in the Sahara, time behaves differently. The same dryness that makes the desert so harsh for living things also acts as a nearly perfect preservative. With little water to wash them away and slow erosion, some ancient footprints have lasted for thousands of years, caught between decay and preservation. In recent decades, researchers have found human and animal prints scattered across what used to be lake margins and riverbanks. They are quiet but undeniable signs that people once walked there when what we call desert was still soil, mud, and shoreline. One of the most poignant discoveries comes from what is now northern Niger, at a place called Gobero. Seen from a distance today, Gobero looks like almost nothing flat, windswept, lifeless. But under that apparent emptiness lies the edge of an ancient freshwater lake that once teemed with activity. Around 10,000 years ago, Gobero was a lakeside community ringed by grasses and scattered trees. People camped along its shores, fished in its waters, hunted nearby, and buried their dead near the waterline. When the lake finally dried up, sand slowly covered their world, preserving it with a tenderness that feels almost deliberate. Excavations at Gobero have revealed dozens of burials, along with pottery, stone tools, and the remains of fish and crocodiles. The skeletons suggest a story not of bare survival, but of a settled, organized society. Some individuals were buried in groups, carefully positioned rather than tossed aside. One of the most famous graves holds a woman and 2 children laid together, their bodies arranged so their arms nearly touch. Pollen grains in the soil around them suggest that flowers were placed with the dead. Even across 10 millennia, the gesture feels familiar. A quiet expression of care in the face of loss. Gobero tells the story of not just one community, but 2, separated by time and climate. The earlier group, known as the Kifian, lived there during especially wet phases when the lake was full and the surrounding land lush. They were tall, strong, and relied heavily on fishing and hunting. Then, as the climate dried temporarily, the lake receded. The Kifian disappeared from the record. Later, when wetter conditions briefly returned, a second group arrived of the Tenerians. They were shorter, more gracile, and may have been pastoralists, herding cattle and goats rather than relying mainly on fishing. Their existence shows what the Sahara's shifting climate did. It didn't simply abolish life. It turned the same place into different worlds, inhabitable at different times by vastly different cultures. It's as though the land itself opened and closed a door with each change in rainfall. Gobero is not alone. Across the desert, from Mauritania to Sudan, faint marks of human presence occasionally surface. Low stone circles mark old campsites. Hearths still bear traces of charcoal. Fishing tools like bone harpoons and net weights lie where they were last used, and then forgotten or abandoned, later buried by dust. In southern Libya, near the Tadrar Takakis Mountains, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of similar lakeside communities, pottery, animal bones, and carvings that suggest a deep, sophisticated relationship with the landscape. People didn't just pass through these places. They formed long-lasting ties to them, learned them, and thrived within their boundaries. Each discovery chips away at the old stereotype of the Sahara as pure emptiness. The truth is more intricate. For as long as there have been humans able to cross it, the Sahara has been a crossroads. The ancient lakes scattered across it function like magnets pulling in animals and people from all directions. Shorelines are natural gathering points, where migration routes meet, where stories and goods and genes mingle. From above, scientists can still trace those ancient shorelines using satellite imagery. Gentle, curving ridges of sediment mark where wave action once repeatedly lapped against the land. Patterns of salt flats, or sepkas, outline the final evaporation basins of drying lakes. These features can sometimes be invisible when you are standing directly on them, but from space they show up as distinct textures and tones. In the eastern Sahara, near the modern border between Chad and Sudan, one dry valley in particular stands out, Wadi Hawar, sometimes called the Yellow Nile. It was once a major tributary that carried water from the central Sahara eastward to the Nile itself. For thousands of years, it acted as a corridor linking interior lakes and grasslands to the great river valley. Surveys along Wadi Hawar have turned up stone tools, animal remains, and hearths from multiple periods of occupation. When that river finally dried, it didn't just erase a waterway. It severed a connection between ecosystems and human populations, isolating them and pushing them onto new historical paths. That isolation might help explain one of archaeology's puzzles: why complex societies seem to arise independently in different parts of the world around the same broad window of time. If the Sahara once supported early organized cultures that were later scattered by drought, those people might have carried parts of their knowledge outward to the Nile, to the Sahel, to the Mediterranean coast. The drying of the Sahara wouldn't have erased their ideas. It would have spread them. Before they left traces. Small everyday objects that now speak volumes. Beads crafted from seashells transported hundreds of kilometers inland suggest long-distance contact or trade. Grinding stones indicate plant processing, perhaps for grains or roots. Decorated bone tools show an eye for pattern and identity, not just utility. Some ancient Saharan pottery is etched with wavy lines, patterns that may echo the look of rippling water. Even in their art, people seem to be honoring the thing that sustained them. In places like the Fezzan Basin in Libya, sediment layers from ancient lakes contain bits of preserved pollen and plant material. Among them are species that today grow only much farther south. Their presence proves that the green belt once extended across areas that now rank among the driest on the planet. It also hints at the pathways humans could take as they expanded northward during the humid phases, following familiar animals and plants as they advanced into newly habitable regions. Where vegetation went, animals followed. Where animals went, people followed. It's a chain of movement repeated across continents. Occasionally, the fossil record preserves something even more immediate than bones or seeds: footprints. At some sites, tracks of humans and animals cross the same ancient floodplains, preserved together. Each footprint is a single moment, frozen, the feel of a step on damp earth at dawn, perhaps, captured for ages. Someone walking alone or with a group, likely unaware that their brief passage would one day become evidence that entire ecosystems once thrived here. In one site in Chad, hundreds of fossilized animal prints cross an old mudflat. Antelope, cattle, possibly large predators. Among them, small human footprints appear, evidence of people moving naturally within that landscape, not as intruders, but as one more species partaking in the region's abundance. These tracks challenge the popular idea of prehistory as a time of constant desperation. The Green Sahara tells a different story, one of richness and familiarity. The people of those eras weren't just surviving on the margins. They were explorers in their own way, keen observers of the sky and the land, able to use plants for food and medicine, able to predict weather from subtle shifts in climate and clouds. Their legacy isn't just in the objects they left behind, but in the land itself. The shapes of modern dunes and dry valleys mirror the outlines of the lakes and floodplains that came before. In the slant light of sunrise or sunset, you can sometimes still see the ghost of an ancient shoreline traced across kilometers, a faint step in elevation, a change in soil, a band of scattered shells. Scientists go even deeper, analyzing isotopes in fossil shells and bones to reconstruct the chemistry of those lost waters. By examining ratios of oxygen isotopes, they can estimate temperature and rainfall patterns from thousands of years ago, turning shells and bones into climate records. It's like reading a logbook written not with ink, but with minerals. The results line up with global patterns. When ice sheets grew at higher latitudes, the Sahara tended to dry out. When ice receded, the Sahara bloomed. The fates of far-off glaciers and nearby grasslands were entangled across continents. There is also growing evidence that the people who lived along these ancient lakes and rivers weren't isolated groups. Tools, pottery designs, and ways of burying the dead show striking similarities across areas separated by hundreds of kilometers. This suggests networks of interaction, ideas, and objects moving along the same water routes as fish and birds. The Sahara's rivers and lakes were not just sources of water, they were highways of culture. The more we uncover footprints, hearths, old shorelines, the clearer it becomes that the Sahara we see today is just one frame in a much longer sequence. Beneath its dunes lies layer upon layer of human experience. Each one was covered when the climate changed, sealed away, and left to sleep. Those footprints and shorelines, those graves and tools, all converge on the same quiet message. This was once a place of life, not emptiness. And yet one question remains, shadowing all these discoveries. What happened when the water finally stopped returning? When the lakes retreated for the last time, and the grasses surrendered to dust? How did those people respond? Did some cling to the last oases, stretching their strategies a little further each year? Did others pack up and follow the water's retreat toward the Nile, toward the Niger, toward highlands where rain still fell? The evidence hints at both. Some groups adapted in place, shifting from fishing to herding, from fixed camps to more mobile lifeways. Others migrated, leaving behind faint trails of artifacts that mark the path of their departure. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this story is how familiar it sounds. A changing climate, vanishing resources, movement driven not by choice, but by necessity. It's a cycle as old as humanity, and one that still repeats in different forms around the world today. The people of the Sahara's Green Age met that cycle with creativity and resilience, leaving behind a record of adjustment written not in text, but in movement. Every preserved footprint, every line of rock art, every burrowed hearth marks a deliberate response to a changing world. The sands that cover their stories are not only agents of erasure, they are also agents of protection. The desert may appear empty, but it is dense with memory. Somewhere within that layered memory lies the beginning of what we think of as our story. The shift from small, mobile groups to more settled, organized communities. And just beyond the lake shores and riverbanks, out among the rocky plateaus and wind-cut valleys, we find the next kind of evidence. Not just footprints or graves, but images and symbols carved to last. Figures painted on stone that speak not only of animals and weather, but of ritual, belief, and the emerging imagination that would one day build civilizations. Продолжаю. Вот следующая большая часть переработанного текста в том же стиле и объеме. Chaque soit dit cast that long before stone towers took the shape of pyramids, before the Nile's banks were edged with temples and the names of pharaohs were carved into history, there were people living across the broad green stretches of what we now call the Sahara. They weren't kings, and they weren't monument builders in the way we usually imagine. But they were already changing the world in ways that would echo long after their own names were forgotten. Their homes stood beside rivers that no longer flow. Their herds grazed in valleys now swallowed by dunes. Their rituals unfolded under skies that once carried generous, dependable rain. If you look far enough back, beyond dynasties, beyond hieroglyphs, beyond the first walled towns, you find them there. Quiet, skilled, observant. People who knew how to live inside the rhythm of a land that has since fallen still. To understand who they were, it helps to begin with what their environment offered. Between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, much of the Sahara lay under the influence of the African humid period. Monsoon rains swept farther north than they do today, filling lakes and feeding rivers that lasted for centuries. Where water persisted, communities took shape. The people of this era hunted, fished, and herded. But their lives were anything but crude. They crafted stone with precision, shaped and decorated pottery, and navigated seasonal cycles with a kind of quiet expertise born from long observation. Archaeological clues to these early Saharan cultures are scattered across what are now several countries: Algeria, Libya, Niger, Chad, Egypt. But the story they tell is surprisingly coherent. Landscapes that now appear uniform and empty once held networks of distinct but interrelated groups. Some were nomadic, moving with the rains and the herds. Others built more lasting settlements near lake shores or along rivers that flowed only part of the year, but predictably enough to rely on. Together they formed something like an invisible civilization, no written records, no monumental architecture, but a shared language of survival, memory, and meaning. One of the earliest and best studied of these groups is known as the Capsian culture, named after the Tunisian city of Gafsa, ancient Capsa, where their tools were first recognized. The Capsian people lived more than 8,000 years ago, long before the earliest Egyptian kingdoms. Their sites stretch across parts of North Africa, including areas that later would become fully desert. They used carefully made microlithic tools, small, finely worked stone blades and points. They fashioned beads from shells carried inland from distant coasts, implying that trade or long-distance movement connected interior and shoreline. In their burials, they included personal ornaments and sometimes used red ochre, suggesting that even in death, Identity and ritual mattered. As the Green Sahara expanded and stabilized, these groups changed with it. One of the most significant shifts was the domestication of animals, especially cattle. Herding became central to life in the Central Sahara. Rock art from regions like Tassili Najar and the Ennedi Plateau is filled with cattle scenes herds, guided by human figures who look not like hunters chasing quarry, but like caretakers managing something deeply valuable. These images are not random decorations. They're records of a way of life where cattle meant more than meat. They symbolized wealth, social ties, and very likely, spiritual power. In many African societies today, cattle still carry sacred meaning, woven into rites of passage, marriage customs, and ideas of blessing and status. It's entirely plausible that this reverence stretches back to the early pastoralists of the once green Sahara. Here, in these ancient grasslands, the emotional and symbolic bond between humans and their herds may have first taken root. This move from hunting wild game to managing domestic animals marks one of humanity's great transitions, a new kind of relationship with the land. The people of pre-desert Sahara weren't just using what nature provided. They were beginning to shape it intentionally, choosing where to settle based on grazing paths and water sources, planning their yearly movements, and likely negotiating land use with neighboring groups. The archaeological site of Nabta Playa, in what is now southwestern Egypt, offers a particularly vivid window into that world. Today it lies in a barren desert, but around 7,000 years ago it was the seasonal bed of a shallow lake. People gathered there with their cattle when the rains came. At first glance, Nabta Playa looks like a flat stony basin, but careful excavation and mapping revealed something far more intricate. Stone arrangements form circles and alignments. Some stones line up with the sunrise and sunset at the solstices. Others appear to mark the positions of certain stars. Alongside these alignments are traces of huts or windbreaks, hearths, storage pits, and animal pens. It was not just a campsite. It was a place of gathering, observation, and shared meaning. The people who used Nabta Playa were not only herders, they were, in a sense, astronomers. To set up those alignments, they had to track the movement of the sun and stars over many years, noticing where on the horizon they appeared at key times. That awareness of celestial cycles would later underlie agriculture, religious festivals, and monumental construction along the Nile. Here, in an open-air landscape of grass and water long before stone temples rose, people were already measuring the sky. The builders and observers at Nabta Playa weren't anomalies. Similar, though less studied sites are scattered across the Sahara. Taken together, they suggest that early Saharan peoples were engaging with time and space in sophisticated ways, marking seasons, planning journeys, coordinating gatherings, and perhaps anchoring myths or rituals to the movements of the heavens. As the climate began to dry again after about 6,000 years ago, these communities had to make new choices. Lakes shrank, pastures thinned. A way of life rooted in seasonal movement across wide green spaces started to strain. People adapted digging wells, shifting herd routes, traveling farther for water. But eventually, gradual change became something more decisive. Rainfall patterns altered enough that the old networks could no longer be maintained. The Sahara's interior began to empty out. Those who had once lived among its lakes and grasslands started to move toward more permanent sources of water, especially the Nile. This movement toward the river valley helps explain one of the biggest puzzles in early history: why complex, organized society appears along the Nile when it does, seemingly quickly, with advanced skills already in place. When the first settled communities form in Egypt's Nile Valley around 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, the people there already know how to manage cattle, how to store surplus, how to track the seasons, and how to use stone in structured ways. Those capacities did not simply appear overnight. They look like inherited knowledge refined and adapted to a new setting. Genetic studies support this continuity. They show links between populations that once lived in central and western parts of the Sahara and those that later occupied the Nile Valley. Archaeological parallels echo the same story: similarities in pottery decoration, burial styles, and symbolic motifs. Even early Egyptian religious imagery, sun discs, sacred cattle, and astronomically aligned structures feels like a continuation of themes first expressed in prehistoric Saharan contexts. It's as though the Sahara, before it dried, rehearsed the ideas that Egypt would one day amplify. The transition from green to arid wasn't a single turning point, but a drawn-out process. Around 5,500 years ago, monsoon rains weakened. Lakes began to dry more thoroughly and failed to refill fully. Grasses gave way to scrub, then to open, dusty plains. For generations, people adjusted, drilling deeper wells, storing water, shifting from fishing toward herding, then toward more mobile strategies. Eventually, even ingenuity reached its limits. The Sahara's heartland became too hostile to support the same density of life. The migration east toward the Nile intensified. Those who had once followed internal rivers now followed a different one, narrow, stable, and far more reliable. That movement wasn't a single wave, but a slow drift. Over centuries, knowledge pooled at the river's edge. Techniques for managing herds became techniques for managing crops. Seasonal camps turned into villages. Observations of the sun and stars, once tied to the coming of rains, became the backbone of calendars and rituals aligned with the annual Nile flood. The people before the pyramids were not just ancestors of Egypt. They were the living bridge between the fluid, shifting world of prehistory and the structured world of recorded history. They carried an entire ecological and cultural understanding from one kind of landscape into another. As the desert closed in behind them, their stories faded from memory. The narrative shifted to the Nile, but the continuity remained in the skills, symbols, and habits of thought that they brought with them. Archaeologists who specialize in these early Saharan cultures often speak with a subdued kind of awe. The objects they find are simple stone tools, bone ornaments, bits of ceramic, but their implications are large. They reveal networks of cooperation, long-term planning, and abstract thinking. People were already modeling the world in terms of cycles and patterns, seasons, floods, migrations, and the repeating motion of stars. In rock shelters in the Akakis Mountains of southern Libya, hundreds of paintings show daily life with surprising intimacy. People herd cattle, milk them, gather in groups, dance, and sit around fires. Children are depicted reaching for adults. Figures appear to play instruments that might be drums or rattles. It is not the world of mere survival. It is a world with time for joy and ceremony, for music and shared celebration. Every one of those images came from a hand that knew the land deeply, where water lingered longest after rain, where grasses returned each year, where to find refuge from storms and heat. When the environment began to shift, they would have been the first to see it in the details. A pool refilling more slowly, a certain spring running weaker, a migration route that no longer lined up with old expectations. They moved, not only physically, but culturally. As they traveled toward the Nile, they carried ideas that would be woven into a new fabric of life rituals around cattle, respect for solar cycles, architectural habits of aligning structures with the sky. These early Saharan peoples left no pyramids, but they left blueprints, conceptual ones. Blueprints for measuring time, organizing communities around shared resources, and grounding meaning in natural cycles. Later civilizations built in stone what they first worked out in open air and transient camps. When modern researchers trace the beginnings of settled life along the Nile, they find echoes of the desert in almost everything. In the way graves are oriented, in the forms of early pottery, in the symbolism of animals, in the very terms used to describe land and sky. With new tools, satellite imagery, radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA analysis, scholars are gradually filling in gaps in this long, quiet story. Each new discovery adds another thread, showing how deeply the Sahara's green centuries are woven into North Africa's cultural roots. And yet, vast areas of the desert remain essentially untouched by archaeology. Political barriers, danger, and sheer remoteness keep many potential sites buried and unseen. Somewhere beneath those dunes may lie entire villages, cemeteries, or ritual sites, intact because nobody has disturbed them since the day their builders left. For now, we work with fragments, a bead here, a hearth there, a cluster of bones half revealed in hardened mud. Each small find is like a single note from a long melody that once filled the air. Slowly, as more notes are collected, the tune becomes recognizable. It's a song about adaptation and imagination, about people who learn to measure their lives by the turning of Earth itself. As the desert wind whispers through the same passes those herders once crossed, it smooths sand over old paths, then sweeps it away again in an endless rhythm. Somewhere under that surface lie the last remains of those who looked up and saw the stars not just as distant lights, but as markers of time and meaning. They may not have built monuments as we usually define them, but in learning how to understand their environment, they laid down the framework upon which later civilizations would be raised. And as we move deeper into their story, we begin to see not just who they were, but how they saw. The next layer of the Sahara's memory lies not in tools or bones, but in art carvings and paintings in stone that speak of animals, rain, movement, and the dawning of belief. Across the Sahara, on cliff faces, plateaus, and the sheltered walls of hidden overhangs, are carvings and paintings that have outlived their makers by thousands of years. Sandstorms have swept over them. Heat and cold have gnawed at their surfaces. And still, they remain faded, but recognizable. Standing before them feels like looking through a window that time tried to shutter, but never fully managed to close. The figures may be worn, the pigments dulled, but they're still legible if you learn how to read them. They speak in a language of images, a curve suggesting motion, a line suggesting water, a repeated form suggesting importance. They are among the earliest storytellers of the desert, and their stories are about a Sahara that breathed with rain. Some of the most famous examples reside in Tassili Najar in southeastern Algeria, a vast sandstone plateau rising from the desert floor. From far away, the landscape looks like something from another world, a jumble of eroded towers and arches sculpted by endless wind. Hidden among these formations, in canyons and rock shelters, are tens of thousands of images. Some are small, a lone animal, a single human figure. Others cover entire walls, creating sprawling scenes filled with motion. They show people swimming in water, rivers thick with fish, herds of cattle grazing under trees, elephants and giraffes striding across open grasslands. The contrast with the surrounding desert could hardly be sharper. These paintings are living proof that the Sahara once looked and sounded very different. Most of these artworks date from roughly 10,000 to 4,000 years ago, spanning the Sahara's last great age of humidity and its gradual return to dryness. In that time, the region's climate transformed step by step, and the art recorded that transformation in color and line. One of the most striking things about this rock art is its quality. The artists used mineral pigments like ochre and iron oxide for reds and yellows, charcoal for blacks, and other minerals for different tones. They applied them with brushes made from animal hair or plant fibers, or sometimes simply with their fingers. Some images are simple outlines. Others show shading and perspective, capturing muscle tone or the curve of a body in motion. In the oldest layers, animals dominate the scenes. Large wild species like buffalo, elephants, and rhinos. They're rendered with attention and care. Muscles bulge, horns and tusks are carefully drawn. These were the giants of the Green Sahara, the same kinds of animals that still roam farther south today. Their presence in the art is a direct, visual confirmation that the landscape once supported a wide, water-rich ecosystem. Human figures in these early scenes often appear small beside the animals, a choice that might reflect not just the physical scale, but also a sense of humility or awe. As time passes and the climate shifts, the focus of the art changes. Cattle begin to dominate the imagery, appearing in herds, sometimes with human figures guiding them or tending them. This is the pastoral period of Saharan rock art, corresponding to the rise of herding as the primary way of life. The images show not just animals, but relationships. People leading cattle, milking them, resting beside them. These were not just resources. They were the center of existence, economically and symbolically. Some scenes seem explicitly ritualistic. Groups of people gather around a single cow. Others show dancing figures, bodies painted or adorned, as if a ceremony is in progress. We can't know exactly what these acts meant, but the repetition and complexity suggest shared beliefs and organized customs. Among the most iconic images in Tassili Najar is a figure known by modern researchers as the Great God of Sephar, or the Horned God. It depicts a large human-like shape with arms outstretched and what appear to be horns or a headdress projecting from the head. Around it, smaller human figures raise their arms, dance, or reach upward. Some scholars see this as early evidence of a more formal spiritual system, a deity, a spirit of fertility, or a storm, or rain-bringer. Others remain cautious, viewing it as symbolic art that might represent power, leadership, or natural forces rather than a literal god. Either way, it shows that these artists were already thinking in abstract terms, connecting the visible cycles of weather and animals to invisible forces of meaning. And these expressions weren't limited to one plateau. From the Tibesti Mountains in Chad to the Ennedi Plateau and the Akakis region of Libya, similar motifs recur: cattle, wild animals, hunting scenes, group rituals, geometric symbols. The consistency across such distances implies that ideas traveled widely, even without writing or roads. Later, as the climate grew more arid, the cast of characters in the art changed again. Elephants, hippos, and other water-reliant animals become rarer in the imagery. In their place, camels and horses appear species adapted to drier conditions and associated with newer waves of human activity in the desert. This shift marks the transition from the Green Sahara to the desert as we know it. Human societies were changing their strategies, trading cattle herds for camel caravans, altering their migrations, and forging new relationships with the land. Yet even as everything changed, people kept carving and painting. It's as though the act of leaving a mark on stone became a way of holding on to water, to memory, to identity. Many panels also include geometric designs, circles, spirals, grids of dots, and repeated lines. Their meaning is still debated. Some might be simple decoration. Others might represent maps, constellations, or symbolic systems tied to seasonal cycles. The recurrence of certain motifs across different sites and time periods suggests they meant something deep to the people who drew them. They might have encoded knowledge about roots, water sources, or rituals in a visual form that could be shared across generations. In that sense, this art becomes a kind of proto-writing. It isn't phonetic text, but it is information preserved and transmitted through intentional symbol. Seen this way, the rock walls of the Sahara are more than just galleries. They're archives. They record what animals lived here, how people dressed, what they valued, what they feared or revered. There is no alphabet in these lines, but there is a grammar of experience. Some images stretch beyond mere representation into something we might today call visionary. Figures appear with masks, elongated heads, or radiating lines. Some seem to float or blur, with limbs extended or bodies surrounded by stippled halos. These scenes have often been sensationalized in popular culture as evidence of ancient astronauts or other fantastical explanations. But most archaeologists interpret them as depictions of trance states, ritual performances, or shamanic practices moments when people felt themselves crossing boundaries between the seen and unseen. In cultures around the world, early art frequently blends the ordinary with the spiritual, showing humans halfway between worlds, wrapped in costume or altered perception. The Sahara fits into that pattern. Rain appears again and again, sometimes as vertical lines descending from above, sometimes as dots surrounding figures, sometimes implied by posture and context. To people whose entire way of life depended on whether the sky chose to open, it's no surprise that rain and its absence would be central themes. If you live in a world governed by erratic clouds and monsoon winds, you don't treat weather as background. You treat it like a character. Careful scientific analysis of these paintings and carvings adds yet another layer of time to them. In some caves, you can see where newer images overlap older ones. Generations return to the same walls, repainting, adding, sometimes partially covering earlier work, sometimes framing it with their own. The result is like a palimpsest, a stack of narratives etched on top of one another. You can read changes in both climate and culture in this vertical layering large wild animals yielding to cattle, cattle yielding to camels. Open, flourishing landscapes giving way to more sparse and linear scenes. And yet, through all that change, the impulse to mark stone endured. These artworks have survived largely because the desert dried so completely. The same aridity that erased rivers preserved images that those rivers once reflected. In a greener, wetter climate, many of these pigments would have washed away. In the Sahara, they remain, sometimes with color still clinging stubbornly to the rock. For scientists, the art serves as a visual cross-check on other data. When rock paintings show fish and hippos, they align with pollen records and sediment cores indicating lakes. When later scenes focus on camels and horses, that matches dry phase deposits and reduced evidence of aquatic life. Even changes in artistic style track environmental shifts. The people who made these images didn't intend to become our climate informants. They were recording their present. But in doing so, they left us an unintended record of 10,000 years of environmental change. To walk among these paintings today is to feel pulled between two realities. The physical desert is stark and quiet, its colors muted. Yet the walls around you speak of noise of hooves, rain, laughter, song. The wind slides through the canyons, and for a moment, it's possible to imagine that sound as a continuation of the voices that once filled these spaces. Elsewhere across the Sahara, less famous but equally powerful panels have been found. On the Ennedi Plateau in Chad, thousands of engravings depict giraffes, cattle, hunters, and mysterious hybrid figures. In Libya's Mesak Sedefet, entire rock faces are lined with engravings of animals and repeated motifs, perhaps marking routes, territories, or sacred locations. Put together, these sites create a kind of mapped network of meaning across the desert. They were likely gathering points not just for water or grazing, but for story and shared ritual. Places people return to, adding new marks, reinterpreting older ones. In that sense, art became continuity when everything else was changing. As lakes vanished and grasslands pulled back, as groups moved and split and merged, the practice of returning to rock and leaving a sign held communities together. Eventually, the climate shift became irreversible. The green withdrew for good. Rivers sank underground, and dunes advanced. Artists moved on with their descendants, carrying their stories to new landscapes. The rock art remained behind, silent, but not empty. When early European explorers first stumbled onto some of these sites in the 19th and 20th centuries, they were stunned by what they saw. Beautiful, complex images in a place they had thought of only as barren. Some couldn't believe that the desert itself had changed so radically. Others assumed the art must be relatively recent. It took decades of careful dating and comparative study to prove just how old these works are and how long a conversation they represent. What lingers in the carvings is more than imagery, it's intention. Each figure, each scratched line, each painted animal represents an act of will, a decision that this moment, this pattern, this being mattered enough to be remembered. In that way, these artworks are among humanity's earliest attempts to resist the erasing power of time. To declare, even without words, we were here. This is what it was like. This is what we saw. Some pigments still hold color rust red against pale sandstone, dark black on lighter rock. In the shifting light, they sometimes seem to breathe, changing tone as the sun moves, as if the images are still alive and adapting themselves to the present. If you look closely, you can sometimes see the small corrections where an artist hesitated. A thicker line here, a second attempt at a horn or an arm. In those small imperfections, the distance of thousands of years feels shorter. Another human, in another climate, with another language and set of tools, paused and reconsidered, just as we do. Above all, the Sahara's rock art is evidence of connection. Connection between people and animals, between land and sky, between past and future. It links us to a time when art was not separated from everyday life, but completely intertwined with it, part of hunting, herding, movement, and memory. Beyond the images themselves, there is also the way these panels relate to the environment. Some are oriented towards specific horizons, where the sun rises or sets on solstice days. Others face old riverbeds or align with prevailing winds, suggesting they were placed with an awareness of broader natural rhythms. It's as if the artists weren't just painting on rock, they were painting with the landscape. All across the desert, stone still carries those whispers. They speak of rain where none falls now, of animals that no longer roam here, of people who return to the same walls year after year, generation after generation, to add another mark to the story. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of this art, the climate itself was quietly turning. As the last humid centuries slipped toward dryness, the people who carved and painted these walls would have watched their world thin out. The lakes would have faded from blue to brown to dust. The herds would have moved on. The sky would have begun to look more and more like the relentless dome we know today. In the vastness of the Sahara, where dunes curl like waves and wind hums across old stone, there are shapes that don't belong to chance. Rings of rock set in place by deliberate hands thousands of years ago rest in quiet alignment beneath an unblinking sky. Half buried by sand, edges worn by time, their purpose uncertain but their intent unmistakable. These are the stone circles of the desert, the forgotten architecture of a world that existed before the desert we know took hold. At first glance, they seem simple. Rings a few meters across, sometimes sprawling across ridgelines, sometimes clustered in arrangements that reach from one hill to the next. To a passerby, they might look like the remains of shelters or the outlines of old corrals. But when archaeologists mapped them precisely, patterns appeared, symmetry, orientation, and repeatable forms that hint at purposes beyond mere shelter. One of the most remarkable examples lies on the flat floor of a long dry lake in southwestern Egypt at a place called Nabta Playa. When the site was first examined in the late 20th century, it looked like little more than scattered stones. But when researchers charted their positions with care, larger designs emerged, circles and lines that correspond to the cardinal directions, and alignments that match the sunrise and sunset at the solstices. In the center sits a modest stone circle, roughly 4 meters across. The stones themselves aren't grand megaliths. They're rough, unshaped, and relatively small. But their placement is anything but random. When tested against astronomical data, the alignments appear to have marked the summer solstice about 7,000 years ago, the moment that heralded the onset of seasonal rains in the region. To the people who gathered there, that date wasn't just a day on a calendar. It was a promise that water, and therefore life, was returning. The builders of Nabta Playa were herders and early farmers. They had learned to read both the land and the sky. Their livelihood depended on knowing when the rains would begin, when to move cattle, when to congregate and share resources. In that context, a ring of stones aligned to the sun wasn't only a monument. It was a tool and instrument for translating celestial motion into earthly timing. Around the central circle, other arrangements appear, lines of stones, clusters, and small mounds that may have served as ceremonial markers or burials. Excavations have revealed hearths, pottery fragments, and animal bones. Evidence that people returned here seasonally. When the playa filled with water during the wet months, the lake would have mirrored the sky above, doubling the stones in reflection. It isn't hard to imagine how a place like that could become sacred. Some stones were carried from several kilometers away, hauled across open ground by human effort alone. That labor suggests the site held deep importance. You don't move heavy rocks through the desert unless what you're building matters. Nabta Playa is not unique. Across the Sahara and into the Sahel, stone circles and related structures appear with intriguing regularity. On the Adrar Plateau in Mauritania, dozens of circular and oval constructions dot the landscape, some with internal chambers, others open. Ages vary, but many are prehistoric, roughly contemporary with Nabta Playa's active period. The same motifs recur: symmetry, deliberate layout, attention to orientation. Some circles even echo the patterns of constellations, hinting that the connection between sky and stone was widespread, not isolated. Farther northeast, in Libya's Fezzan region, archaeologists have documented hundreds of burial cairns and stone rings spread across ridges and plains. Many contain human remains and grave goods beads, pottery, tools laid out with care. Circles mark both life and death, continuity and passage. In a landscape defined by impermanence, a circle offers something endless. You see that shape not only in monuments but in everyday structures. Hearths, storage pits, house foundations repeated across sites and centuries. Practicality plays a part, but so does worldview. The circle reflects cycles: day and night, the year's return, rain and drought, birth and death. In a land tuned to rhythm, the shape becomes more than geometry. It becomes a statement. Beyond their symbolic and astronomical roles, these circles likely served social functions. In early societies, gathering places were essential. They were where groups met to trade, settle disputes, celebrate, and exchange news. A stone circle creates a fixed point in a changing landscape, a place that endures while seasons alter everything else. A traveler crossing the plain would know the direction of the circle, the time of year when others would come, the meaning of a solstice or the first appearance of a certain star. In a world without borders, the stones became landmarks of belonging. Beneath the surface at Nabta Playa, researchers have found more layers, traces of huts or windbreaks, suggestions of longer stays than a single festival or ritual. Some pits contain carefully placed cattle bones, which may represent offerings. If so, they signal acts of gratitude or petition tied to water and fertility. The circle wasn't simply about measuring time. It was a way of engaging with it, acknowledging its power to give and take. To build such alignments required patient observation. To identify a solstice, you have to watch the horizon for years, noting where the sun rises and sets on the longest and shortest days. Fixing those points in stone requires planning and cooperation. Nothing about this was accidental. It was an expression of accumulated wisdom, a relationship with the sky and land that was both practical and profoundly meaningful. As aridity deepened after about 5,000 years ago, sites like Nabta Playa were gradually abandoned. The lake failed to refill. The grasslands thinned. Seasonal gatherings dwindled. But the stones remained. They outlasted the people who placed them and the water that once reflected them. When the desert finally closed over the site, the circle waited, buried and silent. The rediscovery of these structures in the 20th century forced a rethinking of timelines. For a long time, the world's earliest observatories and ceremonial centers were assumed to have originated in Europe or the Near East. The recognition that people in the heart of North Africa, long before the pharaohs built intentional astronomical alignments and created ritual landscapes, challenged those stories. The Sahara's megaliths belong among the early expressions of humanity's attempt to understand and record cosmic order. There's a lineage here too. As populations moved eastward toward the Nile, they carried knowledge of cattle, water, and the sky. The habit of aligning sacred places with celestial events appears later in Egyptian architecture. When early temples and tombs were oriented towards stars and solstices, they were extending a very old habit of thought, to make Earth speak the same language as the heavens. The circle endured across time and geography. In Senegal and the Gambia, thousands of stone circles were raised much later, in the first millennium BC and beyond. They're different in age and context from Nabta Playa, but their persistence shows how deeply the idea of a circular marker took root. Generations who never met, in places separated by great distances, shared a sense of the world's continuity and marked it in stone. The simplicity of a stone ring can be misleading. It looks primitive to modern eyes, but it represents complex agreements about where to place it, what it means, who will tend it, when to gather. It embodies the belief that something intangible, time, season, divinity, can be set into something tangible rock and held there for others to see. In the quiet of Nabta Playa today, The stones still catch the light as the sun rises and sets, just as they did thousands of years ago. The horizon has changed. The climate is different. But the relationship between stone and sky remains. It's easy to imagine the herders who once stood here, watching for that exact alignment, waiting for the first thunderheads of the rainy season to pile on the far horizon, dust in the air, cattle shifting in the half-light. Then one morning the sun rises exactly between the markers, and everyone knows it's time. That moment held significance far beyond ritual. It was knowledge embedded in the land, a signal that bound people to place and to one another. Modern science continues to probe these sites gently, using ground-penetrating radar and 3D mapping to refine our understanding of their alignments. In some cases, subsurface scans suggest that additional buried stones may extend the patterns beyond what is visible, perhaps marking longer cycles or secondary events. Nearby, traces of hearths and habitation layers anchor the circles to daily life. They are not separate from living. They are woven into it. The more we learn, the more the stones seem to speak, not loudly, but steadily, of people who watch the sky not out of idle curiosity, but out of necessity and reverence. People who found rhythm in chaos and turned careful observation into shared structure. In their endurance, these circles remind us that civilization didn't begin with cities. It began with understanding. All across the Sahara, beneath dunes and gravel plains, other rings may still lie hidden, visible as faint disruptions from the air, perfect shapes that vanish at ground level. Each one adds a chapter to the story of people who mapped time with stone. And though their precise meanings may elude us, their intention is clear. They wanted to remember. The desert has tried to erase them. Wind can cover a circle and soften its edges, but it cannot unmake its shape. In that persistence is something deeply human. The desire to be part of something larger and longer than a single life. Beyond these circles, as the climate shifted, the last wet centuries gave way to dryness. The people who built them faced a new reality. The rains grew unpredictable. Grasslands retreated. Lakes shrank into isolated pools. What came next was a transformation so slow it could only be measured in generations, but so profound it would change both the Sahara's face and humanity's course. The desert did not arrive all at once. It came gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, like a long exhale that never quite ended. For those living through it, the earliest signs would have felt like ordinary variation. A few weak rainy seasons, a river running lower, a lake taking longer to refill. People adapted, as they always do. The earth has moods, and those closest to it learn how to accommodate them. But then the pattern stretched. Dry spells lengthened. Rains became fickle. Grasses turned brittle. Dust lingered. Little by little, the ground began to shift beneath their feet, and the Sahara drifted toward the desert we recognize today. The cause lay far beyond any horizon. It was not fortune or punishment. It was astronomy. Earth's orbit and tilt change on slow cycles, nudged by gravitational plays between our planet, the sun, and the moon. Over tens of thousands of years, these Milankovitch cycles alter how sunlight is distributed across the globe. Monsoon systems wax and wane. Ice advances and retreats. Deserts breathe in and out. Around 6,000 years ago, those cycles began to turn away from the Sahara's favor. Northern Hemisphere summers cooled slightly. The African monsoon weakened and retreated south. At first, the effects would have been subtle. Rain still came, but less reliably. Lakes shrank a little each year. Rivers that once ran broad split into shallow channels. Animals traveled farther for water. To people living through it, it might have felt like a drought to outlast, not a new normal. But the pattern didn't reverse. The green ebbed. Sediment cores from ancient lake beds capture that shift layer by layer, where there were clays rich in organic matter, laid down by standing water sand, and dust begin to dominate. Pollen grains tell the same tale. Grasses giving way to desert shrubs, aquatic species fading away. Even the shells of freshwater snails disappear from the record. Change wasn't instant, but it was thorough. In a few thousand years, a blink in geologic time, the Sahara crossed a threshold from savanna to sand. Drying didn't happen evenly. Mountain ranges trapped the last threads of moisture, allowing patches of green to persist longer in higher ground. Springs fed by deep aquifers created oases, islands of life, in an expanding ocean of dryness. Communities that once roamed freely across plains now clustered around these pockets, reorganizing their strategies to meet scarcity. At sites like Nabta Playa, you can read the retreat in the ground itself. Alignments go untended, hearths go cold, seasonal pathways thin, then end. People moved on, their paths tracing the last veins of water east and south. For scientists, this period marks one of the most consequential environmental transitions in human prehistory. It didn't just change a landscape, it restructured the distribution of people. As the Sahara dried, populations dispersed to the places where water remained steady river valleys and coasts. Nowhere did this concentration prove more transformative than along the Nile. Migrants arriving at the river brought skills forged by centuries of managing uncertainty. How to time movements, how to shepherd animals, how to read signs in the sky, how to store and share. In the dependable pulse of the Nile's annual flood, they found stability unlike anything the desert could now offer. From that stability, farming flourished. From farming came surplus. From surplus came planning, hierarchy, and building. In a quiet and indirect way, the climate shift that raised the Sahara also raised Egypt. Those who stayed behind adapted again, relying on wells and on trade routes that threaded from oasis to oasis. The camel, domesticated later, would eventually turn the Sahara from a wall into a bridge once more, allowing goods and ideas to cross even in deep aridity. The drying left marks not only on artifacts, but in genes and languages. Modern studies suggest shared ancestry between populations across North and West Africa, the Nile Valley, and the Middle East. Echoes of the movements that unfolded as the desert expanded. As groups split and mingled, they carried fragments of the Green Sahara's culture into new regions. Myths evolved, words changed, but memory persisted. In oral traditions across the Sahel and North Africa, stories linger about a land to the north where grass grew high and rivers flowed forever, a place swallowed by sand. To imagine living through that change is to imagine a long grief stretched over generations. Elders speaking of lakes their grandchildren would never see, the sky looking emptier year by year, winds feeling harsher. Over time, adaptation becomes resignation. Journeys grow riskier. Old corridors turn to dunes. And yet, ingenuity didn't dry up with the lakes. People dug deeper wells. They learned to read plants and insects to find hidden water. They built new tools, traced new routes, and created new exchanges. A land of abundance became a land of endurance, and those who mastered it became some of the most resilient communities on Earth. The Sahara's transformation wasn't isolated. As vegetation retreated, the land reflected more sunlight, cooling the surface and altering atmospheric circulation. A feedback loop that pushed the monsoon belt farther south and locked the desert into place. The effects ripple outward even now. Each year, winds lift millions of tons of dust from the Sahara and carry it across the Atlantic. That dust fertilizes the Amazon rainforest, feeding a cycle that spans oceans. The desert's loss nourishes life half a world away. The planet keeps its own balances. Even today, traces of the Sahara's greener past remain underfoot. From orbit, you can still see the skeletons of old drainage systems. In the north, sediments in ancient basins hold fish fossils and shells. In the center, petrified wood lies scattered. A forest turned to stone in a place that hasn't seen a real rain in centuries. These relics remind us that the desert isn't fixed. It has changed before, and it will change again. The same orbital cycles that dried it will eventually, in 10 or 15,000 years, tilt it back toward rain. Monsoons will sweep north. Rivers will carve new paths along old valleys. Lakes will fill bowls long kept empty. The Sahara will inhale once more. The change back to green will not arrive in a single season. It will begin softly, almost invisibly, seeds waking after long sleep, Small rains lingering a little longer each year, thin threads of grass stitching together in low valleys. Over centuries, the rhythm will strengthen. The Sahara breathes on a timescale far longer than a human life. Those who lived through the last great shift, who watched lakes contract and herds press closer to failing water, were witnesses to one long breath of the planet. The record of that transition is written not only in sediments and fossils, but in the things people made, in tools adapted to new tasks, in the architecture of camps and enclosures, in art that changed its subjects as the world changed around it. As the rains withdrew, the cast of animals in rock art changed too. Elephants, hippos, and giant buffalo recede. Camels and horses appear. Pastoral scenes full of movement and exuberance become more restrained, more linear, as if abundance gave way to discipline, a quiet acknowledgement that survival now required structure. The places themselves shifted in meaning. Lakeside meeting grounds and stone circles became memorials. The carvings and paintings remained, turning from instructions to reminders, from calendars to elegies. In our own time, the echo is hard to ignore. Climate patterns are shifting again, although on a faster, human-driven timetable. Rain belts wander. Deserts expand or contract. People move because of water too little or too much. The difference now is that we are anchored by borders and cities, by infrastructure that resists movement even when movement is wise. Still, there's comfort in remembering that the Sahara has been many things. Forest, savanna, inland sea, desert. The dunes that seem eternal will one day lie under grasses again. And perhaps on that future plain someone will dig down and find the quiet remains of our era, our roads, our walls, just as we now find the stone circles and hearths of those who came before. For now, the Sahara sleeps in its dry phase. Its rivers are dust, its lakes crusted in salt. But the story of that long transformation is still being written in the wind. The sand shifts, the climate breathes. Beneath everything, the memory of rain waits. Beyond that, waiting lies another question. When the Sahara's people finally left the interior, where did they go? And what did they build when they arrived? The desert silence ends at the edge of the Nile, where a new chapter of human history begins, and where seeds carried out of a fading green world took root in another. As the last of the great Saharan lakes dwindled, people moved, not in a single rush, but across generations. Families followed the retreating water. Herders pushed their animals toward more reliable pastures. Traders traced the ghost ways of rivers eastward until they found a river that never failed. The Nile became the thread that gathered scattered lives into something new. The river rose and fell with a rhythm that bordered on miraculous. Each year, it overflowed its banks, then pulled back, leaving behind a skin of rich black silt. After years of unreliable rain, here was a waterway that renewed itself on schedule. It wasn't just a place to survive, it was a place to plan. The people who reached the Nile did not arrive empty-handed. They brought the desert's education with them. How to read the sky, how to time seasons by the sun and stars, how to manage herds, how to store food against lean months, how to build with stone in deliberate alignments. On the river's banks, they turned those lessons toward a different kind of stability. Before there were cities and temples, there were villages, small clusters of huts ringed by fields of barley and emmer. Archaeological sites in the Fayum, at Merimde, and at Badari reveal communities along the Nile by around 6,000 years ago. People farmed, fished, and kept cattle, as their ancestors had done in the Green Sahara. They built granaries to hold surplus and cut channels to guide the flood. Agriculture was not invented from scratch here. It was adapted and intensified. The Nile itself was an early highway. Boats made of papyrus and wood ferried goods between settlements, grain, pottery, fish, and stone tools. From the south came gold and ivory. From the north, salt and shells traveled inland from the Mediterranean. The connections that once linked Saharan oases now ran along the river's length. Communities grew in conversation with one another. With more people came specialization. Some crafted better pots, some became builders. Some learned to track and predict the flood with remarkable accuracy, watching for the heliacal rising of Sirius the star, whose first dawn appearance coincided with the onset of inundation. Leadership evolved from necessity. Someone had to decide when to open and close canals, when to sow and reap, when to store and distribute grain. Practical authority gained symbolic weight. Those who managed water managed life. The desert past was never entirely left behind. Early Egyptian symbols for life and rebirth are tied to water and the sun, the same forces that governed existence in the Sahara. The circle that once marked time in stone circles reappears as the solar disk, as the glyphs of eternity, as the curve that holds meaning. Orientation persisted too. Settlements and later sacred structures aligned with celestial events, extending a habit of thought that stretched back to sites like Nabta Playa. By about 4000 BCE, distinct regional cultures had formed along different stretches of the Nile. In Upper Egypt, communities like those at Nakkada and Hierakonpolis became hubs of innovation. They built with mud brick, buried their dead with grave goods, and decorated pottery with images of animals and boats. Farther north in the delta, other groups flourished in the wet, branching waterways. The river tied them together, carrying not only goods, but ideas. The step from village to polity was gradual but sure. Knowledge of how to cooperate with nature deepened. Calendars synchronized with celestial cues. Irrigation networks grew more complex. Authority became institutional. When the first kings emerged and Upper and Lower Egypt were united, the foundation had already been laid by centuries of adaptation and migration. Those early rulers were heirs to a long chain of understanding. They knew that power meant aligning human life with the environment's rhythms, storing grain against famine, directing labor for canals and walls, aligning temples with the sky. The black land kemet, the fertile floodplain contrasted with the red land. The desert on either side taught a worldview in oppositions: life and barrenness, order and chaos. That geography shaped their myths as much as their farms. Ancient Egyptian religion carries clear echoes of the desert's earlier cultures. Hathor, one of the oldest deities, often appears as a cow or with cow horns and solar disk imagery that resonates strongly with the pastoral symbolism of the Green Sahara. Ra, the sun god, formalizes the cycle that desert herders once watched for in solstice alignments and seasonal rains. Osiris, whose death and rebirth mirror the annual flood and retreat, embodies renewal in the language of water and grain. Civilization did not arrive like a lightning strike. It rose like a slow tide, swelling from the collective memory of people who had already spent millennia adapting. The mastery of stone, the reading of stars, the intimate relationship with water, these were inheritances, not inventions. The empire that would one day raise pyramids began with mobile camps and stone circles under a Saharan sky. Oases to the west kept older threads alive. Places like Dakhla, Karga, and Siwa became stepping stones, remnants of the Sahara's former lakes, now green pockets linking the Nile Valley to the deeper desert. Traders moved through them, carrying salt and stories. The people who remained in the oases preserved traditions that reached back to the Green Ages, pottery styles, burial customs, and cattle rights. Over time, the growing Egyptian state reached westward through those same oases, seeking minerals, trade routes, and contact. The desert became both barrier and memory. Its silence was sacred. The western horizon, where the sun died, became the realm of the dead in Egyptian thought. To walk into the desert was to walk toward origins. Beyond the Nile, similar transformations unfolded wherever the drying Sahara pushed people towards steadier water. Early settlements grew along the Niger. Along the Maghreb's coasts, communities traded with Mediterranean cultures while maintaining inland ties. The desert divided regions physically but bound them through shared heritage. When archaeologists piece together this story, they see continuity rather than rupture. Tools evolve, but their lineage is clear. Burials change, but not abruptly. The habit of orienting sacred spaces toward the sun, stars, and horizon persists across miles and centuries. It is as though one conversation continued across generations, accent and vocabulary shifting, but the subject familiar. Modern research has started to quantify those connections. Isotopic studies of ancient bones from both the Sahara and the early Nile Valley show comparable diets and mobility patterns, consistent with migration from west to east. Genetic analyses indicate shared ancestry between populations of the prehistoric Sahara and the founders of Nile societies. Taken together, these findings transform speculation into a coherent narrative. The roots of one of history's great civilizations lie, in part, in the memory of a desert that was not a desert. The shift from oases to empire altered the sense of time itself. In the Sahara, time felt cyclical, rains returning or not, stars repeating, herds moving. In the Nile Valley, time stayed cyclical but became cumulative. The flood came every year, but knowledge and monuments stacked up. The circle became a spiral, repetition with ascent. The pyramids, when they came, were extensions of the same impulse that once placed stones in rings to meet the sun. But now the gesture reached upward on a scale never seen before, declaring that aligning with the heavens could also mean joining them. Understanding turned into architecture. Observation became horizon-cutting stone. With power came caution. Egyptian cosmology revolved around Mayat, the principle of balance and order. The idea that the world's harmony must be maintained at all costs feels like a lesson learned from ancestors who had seen what happens when balance fails. The memory of a drying Sahara, of a world that can change beneath your feet, lingers in a culture that prized the steady, the predictable, the measured. The story of how the Sahara's people became the architects of the Nile is not only about advancement, it's about continuity, about knowledge carried hand to hand, camp to village, village to city. Each adaptation remembered the last. When the first empires rose, they did not rise from nothing. They rose from oases of memory, from the quiet stubbornness of people who refused to vanish. Beneath the Saharan dunes lie the outlines of lakes that no longer exist, shapes sketched in sediment and stone, invisible at ground level but startlingly clear from above. In satellite images, they appear as pale ovals and broad basins, ghostly ellipses impressed on the desert's skin. Imagine them refilled, blue against the green of grasslands, and you begin to glimpse the Sahara as it once was, a geography authored by water rather than wind. The greatest of these vanished waters was the ancestor of modern Lake Chad, Mega Chad, an inland sea. So expansive it rivaled the Caspian in North America's Great Lakes. At its height, around 6,000 years ago, it spread across parts of present-day Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Islands would have punctuated its surface. Mist would have hung over it on cool mornings. People would have fished from its shores, gathered plants in its marshes, and camped on its higher banks, with horizons that felt more like coastline than desert. Cores extracted from the former lake bed read like a layered biography. Bands of fine clay and silt alternate with sand and dust, marking cycles of inundation and retreat. Trapped within those layers are freshwater shells, fish bones, and pollen from reeds and other aquatic plants. In some places, ancient strand lines still arc across the land pebble ridges and bands of shells laid down by waves that haven't lapped there in millennia. From orbit, those arcs delineate the high water marks, a neat cartography of memory. When scientists mapped these features, the scale of the change came into focus. Today's Lake Chad, which waxes and wanes with modern rainfall, occupies less than 1% of its prehistoric footprint. The difference is staggering, a reminder that Earth can redraw its own map in what, geologically speaking, amounts to a moment. Culture remembers too. Oral histories around the basin carry echoes of a great water that once covered the land, hints that memory traveled farther than shorelines. North across the desert, other extinct lakes tell parallel stories. The Fezzan Basin in modern Libya once held a mosaic of lakes and wetlands linked by rivers during the Sahara's humid phases. The fossil record there, fish, hippo, and crocodile, speaks plainly of a robust aquatic world. In the Ubari, often called Mandara, Sand Sea, a handful of small briny oases are all that remains on the surface. They glimmer like coins left scattered by a giant who turned out his pockets, ancestors of a watery network that sustained life for thousands of years. The marks of water are etched not just in basins but in long, dry valleys, wadis that snake across the desert floor. Some are so vast you can only trace their full course from space. Their channels branch and braid the way a living river does, complete with terraces and old floodplains. Among the most dramatic is the buried course of the Tamanrasset, running from the Hagar highlands in southern Algeria to the Atlantic coast of Mauritania. In wet phases, this would have been a river to rival the Niger carrying the Sahara's heart outward to the sea. When researchers analyzed radar data from orbital missions, they detected the telltale geometry of this ancient system. The Tamanrasset wasn't a single thread, but a net, tributaries converging from across the central Sahara, collecting rainfall and moving it westward in a broad, pulsing artery. Offshore, beneath the modern Atlantic, a submerged fan of sediment still marks where that fresh water once met the ocean. For archaeologists, these ghost rivers are more than geological curiosities. They are maps to human presence. Along old channels, researchers have found hearths, flaked stone tools, and rock art, the residue of people who settled where water pooled and moved when it thinned. Rivers were lifelines and highways both. As they faded, the patterns of life shifted with them, pushing communities toward the edges of the desert where water still held. Disappearance wasn't uniform. Some lakes evaporated completely, leaving behind white crusts of salt that flash in the sun. Others contracted into oases fed by groundwater that still percolates beneath the desert. In that sense, oases are the living ghosts of ancient lakes, fragments of a once vast system, still whispering where to find green in a world of gold. Hydrologists have shown that much of this water persists underground. The Nubian Sandstone Aquifer 1, of the largest fossil freshwater reserves on Earth, extends beneath Egypt, Libya, Chad, and Sudan. It stores rainfall that fell during past humid phases. Modern wells draw on it, pulling up water that last saw the sky tens of thousands of years ago. Each bucket is a sip of the past. In some regions, the old shorelines are preserved so clearly that scientists can reconstruct them in 3 dimensions. Satellite radar and LiDAR allow researchers to map the contours of ancient lakes, deltas, islands, and the paths of old feeder streams. Feed those maps into models, and the modern desert vanishes, replaced by a connected web of basins and wetlands. In the simulation, water knits the landscape back together. Ghost valleys tell time too. Wadi Hawa, once a great tributary flowing east from the central Sahara into the Nile, appears to have carried water as recently as 5,000 years ago. Along its pathway, archaeologists have found stone tools, animal remains, and remnants of hearths, evidence of human occupation aligned with the river's waning pulse. When Wadi Hawa dried, it didn't just take a resource. It cut a corridor severing a link between interior grasslands and the Nile Valley and changing the trajectories of people on either side. Each vanished waterway shaped migration. As rivers disappeared, they nudged life toward the margins, to the Nile, to the Niger, to highlands where clouds still caught and broke. The ghost rivers thus became invisible borders, defining new worlds between habitability and emptiness. And yet, even in absence, they left gifts behind soils enriched by centuries of silt. In rare storm years, those old floodplains can still burst briefly into green, a quick remembering before the heat returns. From above, the Sahara looks motionless, but these hidden lakes and channels reveal a landscape in slow motion, switching between wet and dry, and back again. The silence hides dynamism. Every dune and basin is a line in that long record. Some scientists argue that if the climate shifts again, the Sahara's rivers will likely follow the same paths they did before. The basins are still there. The slope still directs water the same way. Already, isolated hints of moisture grass sprouting where it hasn't in decades, ephemeral ponds in unexpected hollows, remind us that the desert's story is cyclical. The ghost valleys, in that sense, are not dead. They're dormant, waiting for the next exhale of the planet. In the meantime, the lakes survive in memory. Across the desert and its borders, people tell of hidden waters and underground seas, of wells that never fail. These stories often correspond to places where groundwater lies close to the surface. Cultural memory, carried forward in story and song, has preserved hydrological knowledge long after the landscape itself changed. The desert took the lakes, but not the idea of them. Walk across a dry basin today and you can find small, stubborn clues to what once was. Pebbles rounded smooth by waves that haven't rolled there in 10,000 years. Thin crusts of salt, bright as frost. A scatter of fossil fish bones in a place so dry it feels impossible. Each is a whisper. Water was here. Technology has become the new sense organ for finding those whispers. Radar and LiDAR can see beneath the sand. Satellites can detect cool anomalies that reveal buried rock or damp sediment. Together, they map entire networks of channels and deltas lost to site networks that align uncannily with the distribution of early human sites. People followed water. When water vanished, they learned to follow it underground, digging wells, reading vegetation, listening to the land. Even now, these lost features shape the present. Buried valleys can influence ground temperature, steer wind, and guide the migration of dunes. Vegetation sprouts more readily where old sediments still hold a trace more moisture. Trade routes and trails often overlay the old logic, tracing paths that made sense in wetter times and still do, even if the reasons have changed. Imagine standing on the shore of one of those ancient lakes at dawn. The horizon is a band of green. Birds call from reed beds. Insects buzz low over the water. A herd approaches to drink, their hooves clopping softly in the mud. Campfires flicker behind you, and the air smells like damp soil and smoke. The rising sun doubles itself in the water, stretching along the surface until light and lake become one sheen. All of it is gone now, and yet, in a way, none of it is. The memory remains etched in rock, preserved in sediment, and carried forward in story. The desert's ghost waters show that the rule is change, not stasis. What looks permanent is only paused. The dunes will move. The wind will shift. The rains will return. When they do, the water will seek the same paths it has always preferred, filling old valleys and tracing lines carved long before our time. Following those lines leads from landscape to the human mind, from lake beds and rivers to the people who remembered them even after they were gone. As the basins dried, their reflections lived on in song and story. The sand remembers. It may not keep words, but it keeps stories in other ways. Buried pottery shards, the outlines of old hearths, the faint signatures of rivers that no longer run. Yet not all memory lives in earth. Some of it lives in people, carried in voices, in songs, in the quiet retelling of tales beneath the same stars that once trembled on ancient lakes. When the water disappeared and the dunes began their slow advance, the people of the Sahara carried more than tools and cattle. They carried memory. Over time, memory became story, and story became myth. Across North Africa and the Sahel, echoes of a greener Sahara linger in oral traditions that outlasted geography. Among Tuareg, Berber, Tubu, and Fulani communities, there are stories of lands once crisscrossed by rivers and shaded by forests, of ancestors who lived beside vast waters that no longer exist. These aren't pure inventions. They are recollections, softened and reshaped by centuries of telling, but rooted in landscapes that have since been erased. In some versions, the lakes are gifts, a scatter of bright mirrors dropped from the sky. In others, they are living beings, generous but temperamental, retreating underground when people falter in respect. The moral shifts with the teller, but one theme persists. Water once abundant, withdrawn because of imbalance. In places where rain rules everything, such myths are more than allegory. They are memory framed as guidance. Among Tuareg storytellers, there are tales of a great river that once crossed the desert, stitching distant worlds together. Elders still point to streaks of green after rare storms, claiming they trace the path of that hidden river. Modern science calls it the Tamanrasset, a buried giant mapped by satellite radar. For the people who live here, it has always been a river of the past and of the present, just beneath the surface, asleep. So it is with the underground seas that appear in legends from Mauritania to Sudan. Stories speak of wells older than memory, their waters cool and inexhaustible. When geologists confirmed the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, one of the largest underground freshwater reserves on Earth, it felt less like discovery and more like recognition. Local knowledge had marked these waters long ago. They didn't need the word aquifer to understand that the land itself holds a reservoir of rain from other ages. In the desert, stories are more than culture. They are survival. A tale about a jealous spirit guarding a spring might, to those who listen closely, indicate a real water source. A myth about a sleeping lake may correspond to a basin where groundwater rises close to the surface. Over generations, practical knowledge wrapped itself in narrative so it could be remembered even as the world changed. In parts of the Sahel, songs are sung when the rains arrive, songs that imagine water returning home, rivers waking to stretch after long sleep. The image matches the land's behavior during rare deluges, dry valleys turning to torrents overnight, old channels briefly reclaiming their purpose before heat and wind take over again. The people sing not just in celebration, but in recognition. They greet an old friend who visits less often now. Some ceremonies still echo the landscape's rhythms. Among groups like the Barana and Fulani, post-rain rituals trace the movements of water and wind, slow, deliberate steps, repeated patterns, ripples of motion that build and fade like waves. These practices are not mere performances. They are reminders of dependence, gratitude, and continuity. Fragments of a time when such dances were not symbolic at all, but expressions of immediate connection to rain and river. When researchers began recording these oral traditions in the 20th century, patterns emerged across distance. Communities speaking different languages and separated by hundreds of kilometers told remarkably similar stories of vanished rivers, hidden wells, retreating rains, and migrations that followed water. The consistency suggests a shared origin, likely dating back to the Sahara's habitable phases. As the desert expanded, the stories traveled outward, adapting to new lands but keeping their core intact. These themes are not unique to Africa. Around the world, ancient stories speak of floods, lost gardens, and waters that come and go in cycles. The Sahara's oral history fits this wider pattern, a local expression of a global truth, that water draws the borders of memory. When it leaves, it takes more than life. It takes familiarity. What remains is the drive to explain, to anchor change in narrative, so it can be carried forward. Not all stories are about loss. In oasis towns, Siwa, Gat, Janet legends persist about springs that began to flow at a gesture of generosity, or wells opened by ancient hands as a reward for kindness. Often the tales hinge on balance. Share water and the ground offers more. Neglect a spring and it goes dry until proper respect returns. In a place where water is sacred by necessity, these narratives carry both moral and practical weight. What's most remarkable is their accuracy. Compare certain myths to hydrological maps, and alignments appear. A singing well might describe the sound of air churning in deep limestone shafts. A hidden sea beneath dunes may line up with known aquifer boundaries. Again and again, oral memory anticipates scientific measurement. It's a reminder that knowledge doesn't always require instruments. Sometimes it lives in language honed by observation and need. In many ways, these myths are the emotional continuation of landscapes that disappeared. When lakes and rivers went silent, their voices moved into story. People kept speaking on their behalf. To this day, some desert travelers pour a small measure of water into the sand before drinking, a gesture of acknowledgement, as if sharing with the spirits of old waters. In the Sahara's stillness, such acts are both prayer and remembrance. There are migration stories told not as history, but as prophecy. Ancestors guided by stars or unseen protectors toward new lands when the rains failed. The routes described in these tales align with archaeological evidence. west to east movements toward the Nile, southward shifts toward the Sahel and Niger. The travelers carried cattle, seeds, and flame across plains that had already begun to fade. Each version ends at a river, a mountain, or a forest, with the lesson that adaptation is not betrayal. It is identity. Oral histories also preserve something data cannot: the feeling of change. There are songs that mourn the rains and songs that praise the sun's austere power. The tone is rarely simple sorrow. More often, it is acceptance. The desert is not enemy, but rhythm, one breath of a planet that gives and takes in cycles. Listening to these stories, you hear how deeply people understood impermanence. They didn't deny it. They placed themselves within it. Even the names of places hold memory. Across the Sahara are toponyms that mean valley, spring, lake, or rain linguistic fossils left by waters that vanished long ago. A traveler speaking those names unwittingly recites a map of what used to be, invoking lost geographies with every step. The map itself becomes an archive. Some researchers now collaborate with local storytellers to seek new sites. Guided by myths and place names, they've identified likely basins and settlement areas hidden beneath dunes discoveries neither science nor story could have made alone. It's a rare partnership between two forms of memory, one cultural, one technical, each confirming the other. The persistence of these stories leads to a deeper question. How far back can oral memory reach? Can a tale cross 10,000 years? In the Sahara, the evidence suggests that it can. The landscape changed slowly enough that knowledge could pass through many generations, accumulating like sediment. The result? A chain of memory long enough to carry images of a green desert into an era that no longer recognizes it. In that sense, the Sahara's myths are time machines. They transport lived experience across ages, compressing climate history into narrative. When a storyteller today speaks of a river sleeping beneath sand, they echo voices that once drank from its surface. The continuity is almost beyond belief. And yet, there it is, audible in the words, traceable on a map, evident in the ground. Perhaps that's why the desert's silence feels so heavy. It isn't emptiness, it's density. Every grain of sand covers a story. Every windstorm rearranges the surface of memory. The people who still cross it, guiding caravans, tending oases, walk across the graves of rivers and the whispers of lakes. They live among echoes, some scientific, some spiritual, all parts of the same conversation between human beings and a changing earth. New stories keep joining the old. Climate change redraws patterns again. New uncertainties at the margins of the desert, new hopes on its southern edge. People still look to the sky, still measure time by clouds and stars, still teach children the names of winds. The myths adapt as their ancestors did. The memory of water becomes the dream of its return. Listen to these stories told in tents, by fires, or under open sky, and you realize they're not only about the past, they are about continuity. The desert may transform, but the relationship between people and place endures. Lakes may vanish, but their reflections live on in words, in customs, in the way travelers greet the dawn with gratitude. Beneath the Sahara's endless dunes under layers of sand that shift with every gust lie traces of structures built by hands long gone. Not just hearths and scattered tools, not merely temporary rings of stones, but the outlines of places where people lived together, planned, built, and perhaps even imagined permanence. To speak of cities beneath the desert sounds like fable-like, the kind of tale traded by caravan guides seeking mystery in the vastness. Yet there are signs, unmistakable signs, that long before the Sahara became what it is today, its green plains may have held the first blueprints of urban life. Travelers have whispered of hidden towns for centuries. Greek and Roman writers mention settlements swallowed by sand, describing the desert as a place that hides as much as it reveals. For a long time, such accounts were dismissed as mirage. But modern science has given those old stories new edges. When satellites began scanning the Sahara from orbit, the surface resolved into patterns, grids, alignments, rectangular anomalies that geology alone can't explain. Some of these shapes are the work of ancient rivers and deltas. Others show the regularity of design. Archaeologists analyzing radar and infrared imagery have identified dozens of such sites, most buried beneath meters, even tens of meters of sand. To the human eye on the ground, the landscape is featureless. To sensors, it is a palimpsest, a surface written over again and again by wind and time. One of the most intriguing discoveries comes from the southwestern edge of Egypt, near the Gilf Kabir Plateau. In satellite images, researchers noticed clusters of rectangular outlines arranged with suggestive order right angles, parallel lines, recurring forms. Reaching the area took extraordinary logistics. When expeditions finally stood on that sand, they found pottery fragments, stone tools, and foundations built from blocks, now mostly buried. The layout was plain enough. Intersecting paths like streets, courtyards bordered by walls, rooms that appear to have served as storage or living spaces. This wasn't a random scatter. It was a planned settlement, concealed by sand for millennia. Pinning down exact dates is difficult, but organic remains from nearby layers place human activity in the window of 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, late in the Sahara's last humid phase. In that era, seasonal lakes and shallow rivers would have made the region not just livable, but attractive. The settlement's scale suggests something beyond a short-term camp. It implies a place meant to persist. Similar patterns appear elsewhere. In Niger, near the Air Mountains, archaeologists have documented stone enclosures and pathways that line up like streets edged with circular dwellings. In Chad, on the former margins of Megachad's basin, ground-penetrating radar has traced long, buried walls, straight human lines cutting across the desert's natural curves. When scientists overlay the locations of these sites with maps of ancient rivers, a clear logic emerges. The buried settlements nestle close to former water sources, channel banks, lake shores, and springs. The people who built them understood water's reliability and placed their lives where it endured longest. As rivers dwindled and lakes pulled inward, these communities likely followed the receding margins. The departures would have been progressive generations shifting closer to what remained until the last water disappeared. Then the sand arrived, as decisive as a tide, taking rooftops and roads and leaving silence. In some places, preservation is uncanny. From space, the outlines can be crisp a town plan visible in ghost lines. In parts of Mauritania, circular stone foundations cluster like neighborhoods, overlapping in ways that resemble early Nile farming villages. If confirmed through systematic excavation, such sites could be the missing connective tissue between Saharan pastoral cultures and the first urban centers of North Africa. But the desert does not yield its secrets easily. Excavating here is unlike excavating anywhere else. Heat drains strength, equipment fails. Sand moves at will, burying camps overnight and erasing tracks within hours. You can have exact coordinates and still wander in a sea of repetition. Some discoveries remain unvisited, known only through pixels and plots. The Sahara guards what it keeps. So researchers have leaned into non-invasive approaches. Synthetic aperture radar, magnetometry, and other remote methods now chart subsurface patterns without disturbing them. The results are astonishing. A hidden map of human presence stretching across thousands of kilometers. What was long imagined as empty turns out to be one of the richest archaeological archives on Earth, not because stone pyramids rise from it, but because climate sealed so much of it away intact. The implications ripple outward. For generations, the story of civilization's birth has centered on great rivers in Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus. The evidence emerging from the Sahara suggests that organized communities may have formed just as early in these green centuries between dunes. The same forces that would later shape Egypt water management, sky watching, shared public spaces, were already in play here. There's another paradoxical gift in the desert's dryness: preservation. Where humidity would rot wood and leather, the Sahara keeps them. In some excavations, seeds from ancient cereals have been found intact. In others, scraps of leather, beads, and carvings have emerged in remarkable condition, untouched since they were covered. The desert is both tomb and archive, erasing and conserving at once. Architectural traces offer a window into daily life and ingenuity. Many structures appear semi-subterranean, set partly below ground to moderate heat. Walls are thick, sometimes lined with clay to retain coolness and resist wind. Narrow alleys cast shade and channel breezes, acting as natural ventilation. Built into these plans are insights that modern architects still study. Climate-responsive design encoded in vernacular forms long before written treatises. The organized layout, storage areas, gathering spaces, possible council spots hint at social complexity. These were communities with roles, responsibilities, and ways of making decisions. Their architecture mirrors a balance between privacy and common life, between shelter and shared ritual. Old stories echo these buried realities. In Mauritania and along the Libyan frontier, legends speak of a place called Zerzura, the City of White, hidden in dunes with bright walls and unfailing water. Travelers have spoken the name for centuries, passing it along like a compass point in a land without markers. For a long time, scholars dismissed it as metaphor for longing, but as evidence of buried settlements accumulates in regions the legends mention, the line between myth and history softens. Perhaps Zerzura was never a single city, but a memory of many an amalgam preserved in tale long after their stones lay hidden. In Libya, elders speak of the houses beneath the wind, a phrase that perfectly describes what shifting sand does to walls, covers them, uncovers them, reshapes them, builds and unbuilds like surf. These are not simply ghost stories. They are folk geographies, insistent reminders that worlds lie underfoot. With every new discovery comes a question of ethics, how to learn without destroying. Excavation, even done carefully, changes what it touches. Some argue that in such a fragile context, we should prioritize non-invasive mapping and leave the rest undisturbed. Let the desert continue its guardianship. Others say we must investigate before erosion, looting, or development causes irreversible harm. The debate reflects a larger tension in how we handle the deep past. To reveal is to alter. To leave hidden is to risk loss. Meanwhile, the dunes themselves act as curators. They move slowly, exposing a shard of pottery here, a corner of a wall there, then covering them again with the next wind. A carved stone might appear at a dune's edge at dawn, gleam in the sun for a day, and vanish by sunset. The desert reveals and conceals in equal measure, as if it prefers to speak in glimpses rather than statements. Stand in such a place, and you can feel the geometry under your feet, the murmur of rooms filled with dust instead of voices, courtyards where children once ran, thresholds where elders paused. The silence is thick with presence. Perhaps what is most moving about these hidden cities is how they connect to the larger human story. They make clear that civilization is not a sudden invention, but a continuous thread, a teachable patience carried forward by adaptation. The people who built here laid foundations not only in stone, but in thought, cooperation, planning, resilience. Those ideas traveled with them when they left, and they took root again along other waters. Tracing their faint remains through imagery and wind-sculpted sand changes how we see the desert. It is not a void, but a mirror. Beneath its surface lies the reflection of every culture that learned to live with change. Each buried settlement is a message, written in quiet. Nothing is truly lost, only waiting to be found when the light and wind align. Beyond these ruins, deeper under the dunes, the desert hides older archives still. Fossils of vanished forests, riverbeds from ages beyond memory, creatures that roamed long before people. The Sahara story extends far past humanity into the planet's deep time. To understand what the desert hides fully, we have to rise above it as well. Step back far enough to see the patterns that only distance can reveal. Seen from space, the Sahara doesn't look empty, it looks alive. From orbit, the desert resolves into motion. Ridges curling like swells, valleys twisting in slow spirals, ancient riverbeds, arrested mid-meander. On the ground, the desert can feel flat and uniform. From above, its patterns come into focus. Vast, intricate traces of a world that once thrived here. When astronauts first looked down on the Sahara, what struck them wasn't desolation, but complexity. Instead of a single sheet of sand, they saw layers of color reds, golds, browns, even violets crossed by long, slanting shadows. Some lines are dunes, others are scars. Dry rivers, old shorelines, faulted rock. Under the noon sun, dunes ripple like fingerprints, delicate at the top, massive at the base, sculpted by winds that have repeated their choreography for millennia. In satellite imagery, those ripples look like veins carrying the memory of water along the body of a continent. One of the most arresting features from orbit is the Rishat structure in Mauritania, the so-called Eye of the Sahara. It appears as a near-perfect spiral, concentric rings of rock nearly 50 kilometers across. Early on, many assumed it must be a meteor crater. Later work showed it to be a geologic dome, lifted and worn down over unimaginable spans of time. Even so, its symmetry is mesmerizing. An eye gazing upward through sand, a reminder that the desert looks back. Elsewhere, satellites reveal subtler signs. In parts of Chad and Niger, faint arcs are etched across the land-ancient strand lines where waves once piled pebbles into raised ridges. Around the basin of Megachad, these ghost coastlines stack like contour lines on a map, each one a record of the lake at a different height. Read together, they trace water's rise and fall over thousands of years, a topography of time itself. Modern sensors let us read the Sahara in ways that would have seemed like magic not long ago. Synthetic aperture radar can penetrate the top layers of dry sand to image buried terrain subsurface river channels, deltas, and bedrock. Thermal and shortwave infrared reveal temperature differences that betray hidden rock or damp sediment. LiDAR, pulsing light from aircraft or satellites, builds precise 3D maps of surface texture and elevation, outlining the gentle slopes of old floodplains and the abrupt breaks of ancient cliffs. Combine these modalities, and the desert becomes almost translucent. You see not only the surface, but the bones beneath. Old rivers link up into networks. Lost lakes reappear as basins and deltas. The contours of human settlement, the places people chose long ago, line up with the footprints of water. In some composite images, even the memory of vegetation appears as a subtle tone. Soils that once supported forest or dense grass hold more organic residue and look different to sensors. Lighter sands trace ex-beach zones. Iron-rich sediments mark long-dead wetlands. What looks monotonous from the ground becomes, at scale, a mosaic of environments layered across time. The precision is astonishing. Researchers can track the desert's spread year to year, how sand tongues edge into valleys, how erg systems shift and rotate like slow storms. From orbit, change is undeniable. Human traces hide in those images too. Straight lines of ancient caravan routes stitch dunes to oases paths followed for centuries. Dark patches mark old settlements clustered near wells and dry channels. In some places, rectangles of ancient fields still imprint the land-faint frames where people once coaxed crops from predictable water. The buried river systems are especially striking at this scale. Tamanrasset, the largest, runs like a ghost artery from the Hagar Highlands to the Atlantic, but others branch north and east, tying the Sahara to the Niger Basin and the Nile. The picture that emerges is not of a barricade, but of a crossroads water highways that once linked ecosystems and cultures over vast distances. Radar signatures in some channels suggest residual moisture at depth, evidence that those ancient flow paths still guide groundwater, feeding modern oases. The old rivers aren't just memories, they are still, in a quiet way, at work. Even the dune sea zergs carry meaning in their shapes. They aren't random piles. Each dune field reflects the dominant winds, the obstacles beneath, and the ghost of what was there before. Some align along buried valleys, like waves breaking over submerged canyons. Others spiral around rocky highs. In places, the wind has shaved the edges off long buried cliffs, exposing bands of rock far older than any human presence. Creation and erosion are happening in the same motion. Colors tell stories too. In satellite composites, the desert's palette shifts. Deep rust in the east where iron oxides dominate. Pale yellow in the west with quartz-rich sands. Dark grays where old lava flows and basalt plateaus interrupt the monotony. These aren't just pretty pictures. They're the chemical and mineral history of environments long gone, wetland soils here, beaches and there, the residue of ancient plants etched into hue. Some of the most evocative images are taken not by sensors, but by astronauts with cameras pressed to glass. They describe the Sahara changing with light. Gold at dawn, glaring white at noon, copper and violet at dusk. The long shadows of dunes stretching for impossible distances into the evening. In those photographs, texture leaps waves of sand frozen and moving at the same time. For planetary scientists, the Sahara is not just a terrestrial subject, it's a comparative laboratory. Martian dunes and dry valleys look eerily familiar, sharing many of the same wind-driven forms and sediment behaviors. When rovers send back images of ripples and yardangs on Mars, geologists on Earth pull up Saharan data to interpret them. The desert becomes a bridge between Earth's past and Mars's present, helping us understand how planets remember. These orbital perspectives also feed climate models. Dust lifted from the Sahara each year forms a pale veil that stretches over the Atlantic, visible from space as it drifts west. That dust carries phosphorus and other nutrients that fertilize the Amazon rainforest. It also changes cloud formation and can influence hurricane behavior. The Sahara, in other words, doesn't end at its edges. It participates in the planet's systems-feeding forests, modulating storms, shaping weather far away. At high resolution, satellites even pick up traces of motion made by people and animals today, lines of travel etched faintly into the surface, often following paths that echo routes used thousands of years ago. Geography's logic doesn't lose its power just because climate changes. Where crossing makes sense once, it tends to make sense again. Sometimes the bird's-eye view reveals a mathematical elegance that's hard to see from the ground. Dune fields and eroded plateaus can display fractal patterns, self-similar curves repeating at different scales. Waves in sand echo waves in water, and even the shapes of some clouds. It's as if the same rules, handled by different mediums, write themselves across Earth's skin. Even the most barren-looking surfaces, the gravel plains called regs, offer surprises to radar and LiDAR. These hard, flat expanses often preserve ancient surfaces with minimal erosion, holding microlayers of climate history in place for hundreds of thousands of years. To instruments, they glow with data where the human eye sees only monotony. From above, the Sahara starts to look like something organic, like a fingerprint or a circulatory system. Each dune, each ridge, each dry channel belongs to a larger dynamic structure. The desert is not merely a place. It is a process, paused at one stage of a long cycle. All of this has a way of shrinking human timelines. The cities buried beneath the sand, the vanished lakes and rivers, the migrations. These fill a narrow window between two dry ages. Even as we read the desert's stories at unprecedented resolution, we're reminded that we are looking at a single chapter in a book that keeps rewriting itself. For all our technology, much remains hidden. Sensors can sketch shapes, but not the lives that filled them. They can draw river paths, but not the feeling of watching a shoreline slip away year by year. For that, we rely on the echoes, the art, the tools, the myths carried forward in memory. The satellite view gives us the outline. Human records fill it in. As data improves and models sharpen, the map of what lies beneath the Sahara grows more detailed. Supercomputers simulate how ancient rivers flowed, how winds moved dunes, how people might have traveled between lakes. Each pass adds a layer of insight. And yet, even with everything we can now see from above, the view remains humbling. The Sahara looks whole, self-contained, alive and fossilized at the same time. The patterns don't so much reveal as remind. They remind us that the desert hasn't always been as it is now. That change is the only constant, that even the most unyielding landscapes hold memory. Those patterns lead naturally to a larger question. If civilization once began here in the heart of what is now a desert, could it happen again? Could life return with the planet's cycles and build anew on old foundations when the Sahara breathes green once more? The Sahara looks permanent. From the ground it feels eternal. The dunes unmoved, the air held in a bright, unblinking gaze, the horizon as steady as a line drawn with a ruler. But permanence, like silence, is an illusion. The desert has been many things before this. It has been ocean floor, forest, a web of rivers and lakes, a home to elephants and giraffes, and to people who followed the rain. Every grain of sand was once part of something living. Look closely and you can still sense that memory, trembling beneath the surface. The Sahara isn't frozen, it's paused. And if the Earth's rhythm continues, it will change again. The question isn't whether it can. The question is, what might rise when it does? The idea that civilization could begin twice in the same place feels improbable, but the record suggests otherwise. The first people who built in the Green Sahara weren't granted a one-time anomaly. They lived through one phase of a recurring cycle: abundance, then dryness, rebirth, then dormancy. The same astronomical patterns that once drew monsoons north will do so again. Earth's tilt will gradually shift. Summer sunlight in the northern hemisphere will intensify. Monsoon winds will climb into latitudes they now avoid. The desert will bloom, not tomorrow, not next century, but in something like 10 to 15,000 years on the desert's own clock, the transformation is likely. It won't happen all at once. It will begin in whispers. A few more storms, a few more grasses, a new wetness holding in low basins after seasonal rains. Seeds that have waited through ages will wake. Birds will trace new routes. Herds will find their way behind them. Where the old ghost valleys lie, water will follow the same gradients and carve the same paths. Rivers will sketch themselves anew along lines the planet remembers. For humanity, whatever we have become by then, the change would be impossible to ignore. Cities will have risen and fallen elsewhere. Technologies will have transformed. But the principle will hold. Where water persists, life organizes. Give it stability, and it builds. This future Sahara won't return as a seamless plain of green. It will arrive as patches wetlands ringed by dry zones, a constellation of little Edens scattered across the sand. People will learn them and link them. They'll plant, herd, and measure time as their ancestors did 10 millennia before, but with a different kind of knowledge in their hands. Unlike the first Green Age, the next one will come to a species that knows its history. Those settlers, whatever we call ourselves by then, will understand that the green is a phase, not a promise. That every abundance carries the seed of its own loss. With that awareness, they may choose to live differently, to build with the cycle rather than against it. It's tempting to frame the desert's greening as triumph as balance restored. But the last time the Sahara turned green, humans became dependent on it. When the rains faltered, their world unraveled and reknit itself elsewhere. The same fragility would remain. A new Green Sahara would be both gift and test. Scientists already model what such a shift would look like. As Earth's tilt increases again, northern hemisphere summers warm, the equatorial heat engine strengthens, drawing moisture-laden air farther north. Rainfall creeps over the desert's southern rim, then deeper toward its core. Some basins flood, others remain stubbornly dry. Overall, the pattern unmistakably changes. Even now, there are small signs at the margins. In stretches of the Sahel, rainfall has ticked upward after long decline. Grasslands have pushed back into places they abandoned. People notice when wells fill a little faster, when certain shrubs return. These may be temporary pulses, but they resonate with the beginnings of past cycles. Climate moves slowly, but not aimlessly. If civilization were to kindle again in the Sahara, some patterns would repeat. Water would dictate settlement. Villages would cluster along reliable channels. Fields would follow floodplains. Trade routes would braid the new oases. The same geography that once supported ancient life would guide the new valleys that catch water, slopes that keep it, basins that hold it. The difference would be perspective. Future inhabitants would stand on layers of buried worlds, ours included. They would build, knowing that the desert can withdraw as quickly as it returns. That knowledge could shape everything from architecture to agriculture. Homes designed to breathe with heat and cold. Farms that flex with water's ebb and flow. Communities that plan for movement rather than resist it. In that sense, the next civilization of the Sahara would not be a repetition but a continuation. The desert has already given us the core lessons: adaptation, resilience, and respect for cycles. The people who painted cattle under rainy skies and aligned stones with solstices wrote those lessons in pigment and rock. We rediscover them each time we translate an isotope ratio, trace an old river from orbit, or hear a story about hidden water. The question is whether we'll listen well enough to apply them. Modern technology opens possibilities the first Saharan peoples never had. If and when greening begins, we could guide it, restoring lakes, replanting corridors, and managing water with precision and care. Efforts like the Great Green Wall, already underway along the Sahel, offer a preview: a belt of trees and regenerated land stretching thousands of kilometers to slow desertification, restore soils, and support livelihoods. It's a small gesture beside a vast landscape, but it echoes a timeless instinct to shape the land to sustain life. Some thinkers have floated more audacious ideas: coastal desalination powered by solar arrays, pipelines feeding inland lakes, cloud seeding to coax rain, large-scale irrigation to jumpstart vegetation, and albedo shifts. Critics call such plans unrealistic or risky. Others call them inevitable. The dream persists because the memory persists of a Sahara that was green and could be again. Even with all we can do, humility is essential. The desert is not an empty canvas waiting for our designs. It is a living system with rules carved by time longer than our species. To restore it or to inhabit its restoration would require patience and restraint, a willingness to let cycles stand as cycles. The first Saharan civilizations learned that by necessity. We may have to learn it by choice. There is a symmetry to the thought of civilization beginning twice in the same place. The first time, it rose from adaptation. Humans answering a landscape's generosity, then retreating when that generosity faded. The second time, it might rise from understanding. Humans stewarding abundance with the knowledge that it is temporary. In that way, history could close a loop. The land that once pushed people outward might one day pull them back. The rivers that vanished might run again, and beside them, new cities might grow, built not as a defiance of the desert, but in partnership with it. From orbit, a future Sahara might again look like a mosaic of blues and greens. The old channels reanimated, basins filled to their remembered lines. Satellites would map the return the way they now map the loss, first small blots of vegetation, then expanding webs of wetlands and groves. To distant observers, it might look like a planet healing. To the descendants of those who once crossed these sands, it would look like home coming back into focus. What would those future people think of us? Perhaps they would find our structures buried as we now find the ones beneath the dunes, traces of ambition and wonder scattered across a landscape changed beyond recognition. They might read our data the way we read fossils, puzzling out our choices from pixelated archives and concrete bones. If they're careful, they might see that the story was never only about loss, it was about continuity. That is what the Sahara teaches most clearly. It doesn't end. It changes. It turns erasure into preservation, silence into memory. Every time it greens and dries again, it carries forward a little of what came before. Ideas about how to live with water and without it, how to follow cycles, how to build and unbuild. Civilizations vanish, but the knowledge they leave about balance, about patience, remains buried, ready for rain. If civilization were to begin twice here, it would not be repetition. It would be proof of learning. The dunes that once buried the past would cradle the future. The same winds that erase footprints would carry seeds. The same sky that watched cattle herders and astronomers would watch again, unchanged in its quiet attention. When that cycle turns, the challenge won't be to raise another empire. It will be to build endurance, to create a culture that honors both abundance and the quiet that follows. To treat prosperity not as a guarantee, but as a phase to be shepherded carefully through time. Somewhere beneath these dunes, the bones of older worlds lie beside the fossils of rivers and the outlines of homes. They are the foundation not just of what was, but of what could be. The desert keeps them with patience, waiting for water, for return, for the next beginning. The Sahara can feel immovable. Standing on the sand, you might swear the dunes never shift, the air never blinks, the horizon never loosens its straight edge. But permanence, like silence, is a trick of perspective. This place has worn many faces. It has been seabed and forest, a lattice of lakes and rivers, a range for elephants and giraffes, and a home for people who learned the steps of rain. Every grain of sand once belonged to something alive. Lean in, and that memory quivers just beneath the surface. The desert isn't frozen. It's paused. And if the earth keeps its rhythm, it will turn the page again. The real question isn't whether it can change, but what will rise when it does. That civilization might start here twice. Sounds unlikely until you remember the record. The first builders in the Green Sahara were not beneficiaries of a one-off miracle. They lived in a recurring cycle: abundance, then dryness, renewal, then rest. The same celestial mechanics that once tugged monsoons into these latitudes will do so again. Earth's tilt will shift. Northern summers will sharpen. Moisture-laden winds will climb north into the heart of the desert. The sand will answer with green. Not tomorrow. Not even in the span of a nation. But on the Sahara's timescale, 10,000–15,000 years, the turn is likely. It will arrive in whispers. A few more storms than before. Grasses knitting into the lowest hollows, shallow basins holding water a little longer each season, seed banks, patient for ages, breaking dormancy, birds tracing new arcs through the sky, herds finding those paths on the ground. Where ghost valleys lie in wait, water will remember its roots, drawing blue lines over old gradients, carving channels along the same gentle falls that guided it last time. Humanity. Whatever we have become by then will notice. Cities will have risen elsewhere and fallen elsewhere. Technology will be different. But one rule won't budge. Wherever water remains, life organizes. Give it a little stability, and it builds. A future Green Sahara won't return all at once as a single sheet of grass. It will light up in pieces wetlands ringed by arid margins, scattered patches that people stitch together into networks. They'll plant and herd and measure seasons, much like their distant ancestors, but with a different kind of knowledge in hand. Because the next time, we won't be naive about cycles. Those who settle will know the green is a phase, not a guarantee, that every abundance carries a shadow of its end. With that awareness, they might choose differently. Architecture that breathes with heat and cold. Farming that flexes with flood and drought. Communities that can move if the land asks them to. It's easy to cast the desert's greening as victory as nature restored. But the last time the Sahara bloomed, people leaned on it too hard without realizing how temporary it was. When the rains pulled back, so did their world. A new Green Sahara would still be fragile. It would be a gift and a test. Scientists already sketch the contours of that change. As Earth's tilt increases, summers in the north warm. The equatorial heat engine spins up and pulls monsoon air farther north. Rain pushes over the desert's southern edge and advances toward its center. Certain basins flood, others resist, but the overall pattern shifts unmistakably. Even today, little hints pop up at the margins. In parts of the Sahel, rainfall has crept upward after a long decline. Grasslands edge back into old ground. People notice when wells rise faster, when familiar shrubs return to places they'd abandoned. Maybe these are blips, maybe they're previews. Climate moves slowly, but it doesn't wander without cause. If civilization kindled here again, some things would look familiar. Water would decide where and how people gather. Villages would cluster along reliable flow. Fields would trace floodplains. Routes would braid between oases. The same landforms that once caught and held water would do so again, guiding settlement geography like an old song repeating its chorus. The difference would be perspective. Future inhabitants would build atop buried worlds, including ours. They would plan with the understanding that the desert can withdraw as surely as it returns. That knowledge could influence everything from neighborhood layouts to regional trade. Shaded alleys and thick walls for passive cooling, modular farms designed to expand and contract, shared resources managed with droughts in mind, travel woven into culture rather than treated as an emergency. In that way, a new Sahara civilization wouldn't be a rerun. It would be a continuation, an application of lessons the desert has already offered. Adapt, endure, respect the cycle. The people who painted cattle beneath rain-heavy skies and set stone to catch the solstice tried to write those lessons into the land. We keep rediscovering them by reading isotope ratios in shells, tracing riverbeds from orbit, and listening to stories about sleeping water. The question is whether we'll take them to heart. Modern tools put ideas on the table that were impossible last time. If and when the greening begins, we could nurture it, replant corridors, restore wetlands, steer runoff to revive old basins, manage water as a shared trust. The Great Green Wall across the Sahel, millions of trees and restored lands to slow desertification and support livelihoods, offers a small-scale preview. It's modest against the Sahara's immensity, but it echoes an ancient impulse: shape the land gently so it can keep shaping us. Bolder proposals surface too. Solar-powered desalination along the coasts, feeding inland reservoirs, pipelines tracing old valleys, cloud seeding to coax rain, strategic irrigation to flip surface albedo and encourage further moisture. Critics call these ideas risky or hubristic. Others argue that thinking at this scale will be necessary. The dream persists because the memory persists of a desert that wore green and might wear it again. Even with all our capacity, humility is the starting point. The Sahara is not an empty grid waiting for human plans. It's a living system with a long memory and rules older than our species. To restore it or to live well inside its restoration would require patience and restraint. The first Saharan cultures learned that because they had to. We may have to choose it. There's a kind of symmetry in imagining two beginnings in the same place. The first rise came from adaptation, people answering abundance and then yielding when it retreated. The second could rise from understanding, people stewarding abundance precisely because they know it won't last. In that symmetry, history might complete a circle. The land that once pushed people outward could draw them back. Rivers that vanished could find their channels. Along those banks, new cities could grow, not as defiance of the desert, but as partnership with it. From orbit, a future Sahara might again be mottled with blue and green. Old channels lit up with flow. Basins filled to remembered rims. Satellites would watch the comeback the way they track the lost now. First a scatter of green, then a web, then an inland quilt of wetlands and groves. To faraway eyes, it might resemble a planet healing. To descendants of those who once crossed these sands, it would look like home, rediscovered. What would those future people make of us? Maybe they'd find our buildings buried as we now find foundations under dunes, evidence of wonder and worry in concrete and glass. They might study our data sets like we study fossils, puzzling over our priorities through archived images and numbers. If they're careful, they'll see that the story we lived was never only about erosion. It was about continuity. That is the desert's clearest lesson. It doesn't finish, it transforms. It turns erasure into safekeeping, quiet into record. Each time it greens and dries again, it carries forward a bit of what came before knowledge about water and its absence, about movement and return, about building and unbuilding. Civilizations fade, but their understandings about balance, about timing weight under the surface for rain. If civilization began here twice, it wouldn't be proof of repetition. It would be proof of learning. The dunes that once swallowed the past would cradle the future. The same winds that erase tracks would carry seeds. The same stars that look down on herders and skywatchers would look down again, as steady as ever. When the cycle turns, the aim won't be to stack stones into new empires. It will be to cultivate endurance, to build a way of life that honors both the abundance and the hush that follows. To treat prosperity as a phase to tend, not a possession to spend. Beneath the sand lie the bones of older worlds, the fossils of rivers, the outlines of homes. They are foundation not only for the past, but for what might come. The desert holds them with patience, waiting for water, for return, for the next beginning. Night falls differently over the Sahara. When the sun slips beyond the dunes, the horizon doesn't darken right away. It lingers, glowing faintly, as if the sky is reluctant to leave. Heat releases from the sand like a long, soft exhale. One by one, the stars appear, then all at once, too many to count. In that moment, the desert feels infinite, not in distance but in time, as though every age that ever passed through it is still folded inside the quiet. The Sahara at night isn't truly silent. The wind moves like breath between dunes, sculpting them grain by grain. Tiny insects click beneath the surface, burrowing deeper as the air cools. Somewhere far off, a jackal calls into the dark, and the sound travels farther than seems possible. Out here, the air doesn't stop anything. It stretches everything thin. Each sound becomes part of the land, like a faint echo of memory. Stand in the middle of all that, and there's no clear border to lean on. The sky curves down until it feels close enough to touch, and the ground under your feet seems ready to slip and rearrange at any moment. Everything is movement disguised as stillness. Stars wheel slowly. Dunes drift imperceptibly. The Earth tilts along its long orbit, drawing a distant future 1/fraction of a degree at a time. For all its quiet, the desert doesn't sleep. It dreams. Its dreams are long and patient. They stretch across epochs from when this was an ocean floor to when it was a forest, from when people raised cattle by green lakes to when they left only footprints the wind carried away. The desert remembers all of it. The rivers that carved it, the rains that softened it, the voices that once crossed it. None of those memories vanish. They wait beneath the surface, ready for light or water or curiosity to uncover them again. Scientists, explorers, and storytellers have spent centuries trying to read those dreams. Each grain of sand keeps a bit of information. What rock it came from, how far it traveled, what wind carried it. Each fossil tells of climates that shifted long before people learned to count years. Each carving or ruin speaks of lives that adapted, endured, and changed. The desert is an archive too vast for any one person to hold. It keeps its knowledge scattered, asking us to assemble it slowly and humbly. From orbit, the Sahara glows faintly under the moon-pale ridges stretching for thousands of kilometers. The same satellites that mapped its lost rivers now watch over it in quiet loops, capturing dunes as they creep, dust as it lifts, patterns as they evolve. It looks still, but even from space, motion is visible. Waves without water moving like tides. When the wind rises, it doesn't howl the way it does in forests or mountains. It hums, sliding through valleys in long, low tones that carry both warmth and chill. Sometimes it feels like the land itself is speaking, not with words, but with rhythm. You sense it more than hear it. Maybe that's what the first people here understood without needing to say it. The world doesn't speak our language, but it communicates. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. Where rock breaks through the sand, the remnants of the green centuries still lie scattered. Petrified wood rests like bones. Fossil shells glint in sun and moonlight. If you dig a little, you might find smooth pebbles, rounded by waves that haven't rolled here in 10,000 years. Each fragment reads like a sentence in the desert's long story, a sentence that never ends. it only pauses. It's strange to imagine that this emptiness was once crowded with animals and plants and with people. But the emptiness is part of the story too. It is what remains after the cycle turns. Every civilization, every forest, every sea eventually yields to a quieter form. The Sahara shows that without malice, it teaches by example that change is not destruction, it is continuation. The desert does not erase, it transforms. Those who live at its edges today still carry that understanding. They move with seasons, travel by stars, measure distance by how long the light holds onto the horizon. Their traditions are quiet lessons in endurance. In their songs and stories, the Sahara is never just barren. It is aware, it tests, and it teaches. To survive here isn't to conquer. It's to listen to, learn its moods, and respect its limits. Modern science has only expanded that respect. The Sahara influences the whole planet. Each year, winds lift millions of tons of its dust into the air and carry it across oceans. That dust fertilizes the Amazon rainforest. It cools the atmosphere. It shapes storms. Grains that once lay in riverbeds now drift inside clouds, touching other continents. The desert's reach is global. Even when it seems isolated, it participates in the Earth's balance. There's a symmetry in that cycle. Rain that once fell here now falls elsewhere, feeding forests that depend on nutrients carried by desert dust. Trees that grow from that soil release carbon and moisture, shaping the air that drifts back over the Sahara. Everything is connected. The desert isn't an exception to life. It is a part of the equation. If you imagine the desert's future, you can almost see its dreams taking shape again. Dry valleys could one day run with water, basins could cradle lakes, seeds buried deep might bloom, the fossils of trees might become trees again. It sounds like fantasy. It isn't. It's the planet's long rhythm, repeating on a scale beyond our lives. When that happens, people will return. They always do. Life will find the old roots, settle near the familiar water, and begin again. That may be the most humbling truth the Sahara offers. Nothing truly disappears. Civilizations end, languages fade, but patterns remain, waiting for their turn. The desert keeps them safe, wrapped in sand and silence. When the time is right, it gives them back. The wind shifts, the rains return. Memory becomes landscape once more. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear that promise in the wind tonight, a faint thread under the constant motion, like the sound of breath in sleep. The dunes sigh softly. The sand slides over itself. And somewhere far beneath, water still moves. Deep, slow, and patient. The Sahara isn't dead. It's dreaming. Inside those dreams are traces of everything it has been. First lakes, herders carving stone, hidden towns buried in time, travelers' myths, stars mirrored in water. All of it still exists here in a form only the patient can read. The desert doesn't forget. It waits. One day, when the planet tilts again and the cycle turns, this sea of sand will stir. Rivers will flow where dunes once stood. The air will smell like rain. The stars will be in their places, watching, and maybe, on some quiet night, people will sit beside new lakes and tell stories about the age when the desert slept. They will speak of ancestors who crossed an ocean of sand, guided by memory and stars, carrying the idea that everything returns if you wait long enough. Until then, the Sahara remains as it is, vast, luminous, endlessly shifting. It teaches through stillness, reminding us that beneath apparent emptiness lies movement, connection, and continuity. The dunes will keep their slow rhythm. The wind will keep shaping their edges. And beneath it all, the planet will keep turning. The desert dreams on. It always has. Somewhere in that dream, humanity still walks ancient shores, listening to time carried softly through sand. Thank you for drifting through this journey, for listening to the Sahara's quiet and the echoes of what it once was. These stories are small reminders that Earth is not static, that everything beneath our feet has lived other lives. Desert, oceans, forests. They're all chapters in the same long memory. If this calm exploration helped you slow down or see the world a little differently, you can stay close to it. Subscribe if you'd like to keep wandering with me. Every story here starts the same way, quietly, with a question about how the planet remembers itself. For now, rest easy. Let your thoughts wander like wind over sand. The Earth is still turning, the dunes are still shifting, and somewhere in the dark, the desert is still dreaming. Good night from Echoes of the Forgotten Earth. Sleep well.